He felt like a useless D-rank blacksmith, the kind of person who got laughed at whenever he introduced himself as a hunter. Deep down, he knew he would probably die like a useless piece of shit. If he could just get stronger than anyone, even if he was just a support class, maybe his life could be different. It was the final step that unlocked everything, and at last, Shin Junseo was ready to step into the world as a player. Shin was rushing through the forest, thinking about how he was late on such an important day. He met up with two people, and the girl, who was a C-rank hunter, said that finally he was there. Her name was Kim Jimin. A guy, Lim Do-won, joked about a newbie being late. Just as he was about to say something about his own experience, Jimin cut him off, asking him not to bring up after all. He was always the one getting late. Shin apologized for being late, and the three of them set off together. Lim joked again, saying Shin wasn't that late after all. Kim agreed, adding that they could just walk the rest of the way since Hyunwoo and Do-yoon were already inside. Shin nodded but couldn't help feeling bad. It had been 3 months since he joined the guild, and this was his first dungeon raid. And of course he ended up late. To make matters worse, he would be there as support, so he had to prove he was useful. When they met up with the other two, Do-yoon asked Shin if this was his first dungeon raid. Shin confirmed, saying he would be there as support. Do-yoon then explained that supports didn't have the same fighting abilities as hunters, so Shin would need to be extra careful. If he got too close to the fight, he could get swept up in it, but if he stayed too far, the others wouldn't be able to protect him. The key, Do-yoon said, was to keep up a distance. Since Shin was a maker, he just needed to stay back, waiting for the signal so he could create a dagger when needed. Shin then asked if it was really that easy, and Do-yoon nodded, confirming that the weapon Shin had was fine for now. Do-yoon also mentioned that it was an easy dungeon and that it was Shin's first one, so he didn't need to overwork himself. Just then, Lee Hyunwoo activated his mana, stating that since he could feel it, there must be a monster nearby. Lim told everyone to get ready for battle and said they would move in formation. Do-yoon turned to Hyunwoo and asked if there were any remarks. Hyunwoo replied that there were 3 small mana signatures and 1 big one. The big one was enough to be considered a boss monster. Do-yoon raised an eyebrow. Normally, the bigger ones stayed within their designated areas. He then said he would take on the boss and told the others to handle the smaller monsters. He asked Shin how long it would take to make a dagger if he hurried. Shin thought for a second and replied that around 20 seconds, but it will only last less than a minute. Do-yoon gave a satisfied nod and said that it was good and asked to start making it now, and they will get this done in 40 seconds. Just then, 3 blue monsters and 1 purple one appeared, charging toward them. Liv immediately took action, raising his shield and slamming it down onto the ground with deadly force. Meanwhile, Kim took out one of the monsters with a swift punch. The other 2 rushed forward to take on the others, but Kim noticed that the monsters were healing much faster than she had expected. She warned the group, letting them know they should be extra cautious. Lim and Lee were already in position, ready with their weapons and magic prepared for whatever came next. Lee used his magic to attack the monsters, launching a fireball that quickly took them out. He seemed pleased with the results, and Lim suggested that Shin help as well. Shin thought the attack order was great, and it was at that moment that he truly understood how the guild fought. Do-yoon called over to him, asking about the weapon. Shin mentioned that everything was ready, but he didn't want to get distracted. He continued making the dagger and threw it toward Do-yoon, who caught it easily. Do-yoon rushed forward, infusing the dagger with dark aura before slashing through the boss monster's head in a single strike. After a moment, the dagger disappeared as it had served its purpose. Lim looked around and wondered if anyone had been hurt. Kim quickly replied that she was fine. Shin, meanwhile, was impressed. The guild was much stronger than he had imagined. Each member was incredible on their own, and their teamwork was flawless. With enough accomplishments, they could easily become a top-tier guild. Compared to them, he felt like he was just someone who could make one dagger, not really contributing much. He wasn't sure if he even deserved to be in the same group as them. Do-yoon approached, patting him on the back and asking if he was okay. Shin denied it, thanking him and saying he wasn't really much help. Do-yoon raised an eyebrow, wondering why he thought that. He explained that because of Shin's help, he was able to save a lot of money. He revealed that his skill allowed him to consume weapons, meaning he wouldn't be able to afford even the cheapest ones on his own. That's why he needed a maker like Shin. It seemed all he needed was a weapon infused with mana to activate his skill. Once again, Do-yoon praised Shin for his work on his first dungeon raid and said he was looking forward to working with him again. Shin felt motivated by the compliment, thanking Do-yoon and promising to do his best in the future. Lim then suggested they take the loot, but before he could say more, the ground beneath them started shaking. Kim wondered if it was an earthquake. Lee quickly confirmed that the cave wasn't collapsing because they had already taken down the boss. Shin pointed ahead and said the wall seemed to be crumbling. Lee used his powers to get better look and confirm that it was like a pathway opening up, with the vibrations leading to another area. As Do-yoon mentioned the possibility of a secret place, Kim got excited and asked if this was the pathway to hidden treasure. She immediately urged everyone to go check it out. Kim was practically bouncing with excitement, but Lee told them to wait. It wasn't safe to rush inside. Do-hyun asked Lee if he had found anything, but Lee shook his head. Do-hyun wasn't too concerned, saying that the place wasn't going to completely fall apart. They would be quick. Lim, confirming that the guild master agreed, said to let's get inside. Lee, after a moment, agreed to join them. Do-hyun then called out to Shin, asking him to come along too. The scene shifted, and now Shin was running, chased by a monster. He couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. Everyone except him was dead. This wasn't a monster that should have been in a D-ranked dungeon, and you would never heard of a monster that couldn't be detected by magic. The monster closed in, about to catch him. It landed a punch that sent him crashing to the ground so hard he spat up blood. His hands trembled as he tried to get up. He couldn't die like this. The monster lunged again, and Shin quickly made a dagger to throw at it, but it had no effect. The monster punched him once more, sending him crashing into the ground. The ice beneath him cracked, revealing water underneath. As he fell in, Shin thought to himself, so this was how it ended. D-rank support who can even use basic buffs like healing. He had finally joined a guild that actually needed him, but here he was running away like a coward, too pathetic to even be of use. He couldn't help but think that someone else would have been more helpful in this situation. Maybe he should have never become awakened. It was a dream he could never have reached. Then, out of nowhere, a screen appeared in front of him, telling him that he had discovered the spring and fulfilled all the conditions to become a player. Just as he saw the message, a bright light began to shine around him. A screen in front of Shin, showing he had received a new reward and needed to choose whether or not to check it. He wondered about this player thing and the reward. His mouth hung open for a moment as he thought about drinking some water, but then he snapped himself out of it. You don't know what's going on, and honestly, you don't care, he thought. He decided to just select yes. Suddenly, a massive dagger appeared, forming a set of stairs that helped him climb out of the ice and stand up against the monster. The system's voice echoed in his mind, saying he will inherit the experience of his previous life. Reward distribution completed. He used his power to summon several swords, launching them at the monster. The swords hit, and the monster was quickly taken down. Shin was left wondering what had just happened, and he felt unknown memories starting to take root in his mind. Before he could process it, the monster lunged at him. Reacting quickly, he created a giant shield just in time to block the attack. As the monster's punch slammed into the shield, Shin was shocked that he didn't take any damage. Even though it was a golem-type monster, it had incredible durability. But the shield was soon shattered by the monster's next hit, and Shin took a step back. If the information from those memories was correct, he thought, even though it's a golem-type, its weak points and the tactics to take it down should still be the same. The problem was, the monster didn't seem to have any obvious weak points. Even if it took damage, it had a regeneration ability. So Shin decided to use his skill, Grid World, to get the upper hand. It was recommended that he deal damage from multiple angles at the same time. With his skill as the center point, he could materialize a grid in an equal distance radius. Anything created within this grid could move freely according to the user's will. Shin quickly released the attack, sending the grid to strike the monster from all sides, breaking it into pieces and killing it. At first, Shin thought of Grid World just as an auxiliary skill, something to help him use his creations more efficiently. But it seemed that as the skill's proficiency grew, it could also be used as an offensive attack on its own. The system window popped up, showing that the monster had been defeated. Shin was curious but also confused. Could he not see the information about the dungeon monsters? Suddenly, a purple aura gathered around him, and just as he wondered what it was, a magic ball appeared in his hand. The system notified him that he had activated the passive magic absorption, but he still had no idea what that actually meant. His thoughts wandered to what had just happened. The memories from his previous life were coming back, but they didn't make much sense. He tried to make sense of them. He could clearly remember a few years into the future. In that future, the world had fallen, and there were things too terrible to even mention. Somehow, he had absorbed all the experiences and knowledge from that future. But even though it was a future, Shin knew it probably wasn't the same future as the world he was currently in. There were so many things that didn't add up, and the status screen in front of him was something he had never seen in his previous life. He finally realized that he had really become a player. The term player referred to those few who were chosen and had undergone an awakening. According to his memories, players didn't exist in the world back then. In fact, 2 years from now, only a small number of awakeners would be chosen to become players. A blue screen would appear, visible only to those chosen, and in the future, a mysterious force called the System would shock all awakeners around the world. It sounded almost like a joke, but it was enough to leave everyone in disbelief. The System wasn't the only thing given to players. They also received unique rewards, strength, and skills that went far beyond what they had as awakeners. The System and these rewards came out of nowhere. Once the players started using them, their growth exploded compared to other awakeners. And thanks to the work of the guild leader, who was one of the first to become a player of the Doan Guild, the guild Shin was a part of was able to grow into a top-tier guild. While Shin didn't have a direct role in that, it was the catalyst for his growth in his previous life. Standing confidently in a developing guild, he had once thought it was convenient when he first heard about it. But now he truly understood how much of an advantage it had been. He thought he could check the skills he would learn and their proficiency in the system window, and it was pretty convenient when he found out about it. If his skill proficiency had transferred over from his previous life, the skill he used on the golem's corpse was something he didn't have back then. He hadn't heard of any other players with a skill like that, so he wondered if it was something only he had. The skill gathers energy from contaminated mana, and he had a vague idea of how to use it, so he decided to think about it later. Then he looked at the other dead bodies and said that taking care of them was the priority. The scene shifts to the Hunter Association headquarters, where a lady asked a boy if they just sent Shin home. The man was confused and asked what she meant. She explained that it was strange. A small guild had attacked an unconfirmed dungeon, and there had been an accident. 4 out of 5 members died, and the only survivor was a D-rank supporter. She said she would understand if he had run away while the other hunters were fighting, but that wasn't the case. He even took care of the bodies and reported everything to the association. Since the gate had already disappeared, they couldn't confirm anything further. She then asked him what he thought, mentioning that something felt off. He asked her if she really thought a D-rank supporter could kill a hunter, then patted her head with a file, telling her to wake up. He reminded her that this wasn't a civilian case and that, even if something weird happened, they couldn't really figure out what went on in the dungeon. She mentioned that it was hurting. He asked her if she didn't have any other guesses, saying it seemed to happen more often these days. He then started moving away, mentioning that hunters who find a great dungeon and don't report it were a problem. If they report it to the association and it goes to auction, all they get was some prize money. So instead, they risk their lives to go in secretly. After all, it's almost impossible for a small guild to win a bid on a gate. He then told her to just call him if they needed additional investigation or something. She agreed. The man left, glancing at the file and noting that the boy's name was highlighted. He thought that even though he would said all that earlier, it still felt different from a normal case. The whole situation had this lingering feeling that something was off. First of all, the boy's behavior during the investigation wasn't calm at all. He had almost no dungeon experience and had just witnessed an accident, so it wasn't weird for him to be panicking. There were some missing details, but the boy explained everything cleanly. Maybe it was just his personality. Still, something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was frustrating, but it wasn't something for him to worry about now. He would have to go and check things out himself. On the other hand, Shin was walking while using his phone, thinking that no matter how he looked at it, something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling about the unconfirmed gate. The dungeon didn't exist in the memories of his previous life, and when a guild member checked the gate bid form, it definitely had the association's stamp on it. But it was still listed as an unconfirmed gate by the association. Someone must have impersonated the association and tricked the Doan Guild, or maybe the association itself was involved. What bothered him even more was that it hadn't just happened to the Doan Guild. As the investigator mentioned, there were already multiple cases involving unconfirmed gates and missing people, and even though he didn't know all the details, he noticed a common theme among all the guilds mentioned in the news. They all had players in them, like guild leader Doyun, and even prodigies who would be called heroes in the future. It seemed like someone wanted to erase the existence of those heroes. That's when he decided he had to hide his abilities for now. He would become the only survivor of a missing person case that would likely remain unsolved. If he acted suspicious, he would get caught immediately. He had about 2 years until the first player selection to prepare. He needed to use every skill at his disposal and by that time develop even more. He had to find a way to grow without drawing too much attention. As he checked his usable skills, he found something interesting and clicked on it. A year had passed and a group of people found themselves in the forest fighting off monsters. As he struck one of the monsters, his sword broke and the creature knocked him back. He barely managed to land safely. Suddenly, the monster leaped at him again and he tried to dodge. Everyone around him was terrified. It was then that they realized the monster was a Null Lord. The boy spoke up, recalling that such creatures only appeared in E-rank dungeons, so it should freeze to death. You would also hear that even among D-rank monsters, a Null Lord was tough to deal with. The monster charged at them, passing him to attack another person. The second boy raised his shield to block, but he was struggling. He warned that if they kept blocking like this, they wouldn't last long. The first boy thought for a moment about the death gods of low-level hunters. The reason Null Lords were called that wasn't just because of their physical strength, but because monsters of that rank were usually weak to magic. No matter how low-level an adventuring party was, they relied heavily on magic. However, the Null Lord didn't follow that logic. Hunters who were usually confident in their low-level magic found themselves terrified for the first time. and the price for their overconfidence and complacency was usually the total annihilation of the party. He knew they only had one pure physical damage dealer, and he was terrible at hand-to-hand combat. His weapon had been completely destroyed, and he didn't have any spare weapons left, so he couldn't understand why the second boy was asking him to attack the monster. If he had known it would turn out like this, he wouldn't have been so greedy and gathered as many people as possible. He hadn't realized that his decision to use as few people as possible and include a magician would cause so much trouble. Then he spotted a boy mining off in the distance, someone who was also a helper. The first boy thought to himself that they already had a helper, but they were all about to die, and yet this other helper was acting so careless. As he watched, he saw the helper's weapon disappear, and he wondered if the boy had any maker aptitude. At this point, he couldn't expect much in terms of quality, but it was worth asking. He called out to the helper, who turned out to be named Shin. The boy walked up to Shin and asked if he was a maker, and if he could make a sword. Shin agreed, and the boy requested a sword, one that was sturdy and strong. Shin apologized, mentioning that he had joined as a helper, not as support. The boy replied, saying it wasn't the time to be making excuses. Didn't Shin see that they were all about to die? Evening would die if they didn't manage to kill the boss. Shin started making the sword, mentioning that there would be one condition. Once they cleared the dungeon, the boy had to forget everything about Shin's abilities. Also, when he received his share, he would have to pay Shin the amount on average support. If the boy was okay with that, Shin would help. The boy scoffed, wondering what kind of quality Shin's sword would be, given that he couldn't even get a job as a maker and was stuck running around as a helper. He didn't think they could clear the dungeon with just any weapons, and if Shin was going to be stubborn, it wouldn't help. Shin responded, laughing. He said it was funny, because good weapons were an essential part of clearing a dungeon, and as long as he had that necessary element, he guaranteed they would be able to clear it. With that, Shin started making the sword. The scene then shifted to the Overkill Guild, one of the 3 major guilds in Korea. A girl knocked on the president's office door. The president called for her to come inside. She entered and mentioned that the Awakeners Association had requested their cooperation, especially due to a dungeon with a rank error. She agreed with the president's assumption that on the surface it was a request for cooperation, but it seemed like they would be willing to pay whatever Overkill asked. The president stated that those other guilds didn't have a choice. She added that there were barely any Awakeners who could enter a gate that had been forcibly closed. The president was watching the news when he saw a report about a group of hunters who had entered a dungeon with a rank error. As he looked at the group's photo, he spotted Shin and thought to himself that he had seen that face before. Then it hit him. A few weeks ago, a dungeon with a rank error had appeared in Sokogan, and the president had been dispatched to the area. He would drop by the scene, and that's where he had seen Shin. According to the report, Shin was listed as a helper. Even though rank error dungeons were still rare, with the survivors of such dungeons being counted on one hand, Shin had participated in 2 parties where everyone survived not once, but twice. It couldn't just be a coincidence. The girl then mentioned that more and more rank error dungeons seemed to be appearing. Just a few days ago, a D-rank dungeon had turned into a B-rank one, and the entire party had been annihilated instantly. The president responded, saying that the Awakeners Association must be having a headache over this. The girl added that many people were criticizing the association as it was their job to estimate, analyze, and announce the rank of a dungeon. The president thought to himself that the association must be suffering right now. He then suggested that those with a trespass skill in their guild should take on more commissions for a while and keep an eye on the situation. Then he wondered about the task he had asked her to look into. She mentioned that she had looked into it here and there, but she couldn't find a weapon maker who was a rank or higher. However, she did receive a B-rank weapon from a Japanese blacksmith, and she wondered if the president would want to test it. He replied, saying that she knew how any weapon below a rank would be destroyed as soon as he used his skills, and that there were only a few makers who were capable of making higher quality weapons to begin with. He stood up and asked her to look into it for now, as he was reaching his limit of wasting weapons like that. She agreed, and just as she did, someone entered the room, informing President Taehyun that something had happened. Taehyun asked what was going on, and the man explained that he had checked the location of the dispatch request sent by the association. It turned out to be a D-rank dungeon where some of their newbies had entered as part of a free attack team. Taehyun asked about the measured ranks after those entries. The man revealed that it was ranked C, or an upper C rank. Taehyun, looking serious, said that he couldn't afford to lose his newbies, and it seemed like an urgent situation, so he would go there himself. The scene shifted to the dungeon gate, where the media was reporting on the situation. The crowd saw President Taehyun along with the girl and the man, and the reporters began asking the president to comment on the ongoing issue with rank error dungeons. Someone mentioned that the association had sent a cooperation request to them for the dungeon entry, and if those rumors were true, was that the reason Taehyun came himself because his guild members were part of the dungeon attack team. A lady there thanked Taehyun for coming, saying she didn't expect him to show up in person. When he asked about the situation, she revealed that the attack team consisted of 6 hunters, 2 supporters, and 1 helper. All of them had higher than required qualifications, but those numbers didn't matter. The dungeon had been reanalyzed as a C rank. Tae then asked how long it had been since the attack team entered. She replied that it had been almost 2 hours. Tae stated that he didn't know how many were still alive, but he would do what he could. With that, Tae-hyun, along with Minhisu the girl, stood in front of the dungeon gate. She handed him a sword and he used his skill trespass to slash it, creating a flare of energy that caused a strange black area to appear ahead. This skill involved forcefully pushing through the racks of mana. It could bypass walls or barriers, including gates. However, while it worked in another dimension, it only affected the user, not the surrounding area. The sword broke as a result. After handing it back to Min, Tae-hyun told her to be careful, and she wished him the same. He finally entered, taking in the humidity and temperature. Considering the bad smell, he guessed it was some kind of reptile. When he noticed there were no pollutants on the floor, he figured it was a monster with some level of intelligence. Based on the dungeon's rank, the answer was clear. It was a lizard man. He crossed over numerous dead bodies of monsters, thinking that by looking at the lizard man corpses, he could estimate the size of the group and their fighting capabilities. He also noted the level of distress the party had been in, as identified in the preliminary report. They were likely all dead by now, and he couldn't help but fear the worst-case scenario. Suddenly, he heard a rumbling sound. Moving forward, he arrived at the location of the party and saw the situation with his own eyes, something he hadn't expected. A monster was attacking a hunter with a sword, while the other hunters continued battling. Tae-hyun observed from the side, thinking that the lizard man were clearly overwhelming them. Judging by their speed and movement, the lizard man were far stronger. Then he saw one of the lizard men strike a hunter's sword, sending it flying a good distance away. The monster was about to attack the unarmed man with a sword when Tae-hyun thought it's not too late yet. As the lizard man swung his weapon, Shin appeared, making a sword materialize in midair to block the blow. Tae-hyun still hadn't reached them, but he wondered if it was magic, how else could a weapon appear out of thin air? He watched as Shin used his magic to create the sword, and as their eyes met, they locked in a brief but intense moment of recognition. Shin quickly counted the people around him, and when he counted Ta as the 10th, he remarked that he was sure only 9 had come in. Ta wondered what Shin was talking about. Just then, another lizard man knocked a hunter back and was about to attack, so Tae rushed in with his sword. Shin couldn't believe Ta had come to rescue them himself. He was carrying around a weapon he didn't even use, and Shin wondered if that was his sphere weapon. Ta used his sword to block the lizard man's attack and then ordered the others to fall back. With a swift motion, Ta unleashed a series of slashes, creating flares with his sword that cut down the lizard man in an instant. He thought to himself that he hadn't even used his full strength yet. The weapon was clearly B rank, but it felt so weak. As Ta took down the lizard man, another one appeared to attack. Ta dodged and avoided the blow, causing the lizard man to crash to the ground. Shin approached Ta and asked if this always happened when he used his skills, commenting that it looked like some serious wear and tear on the weapons. Ta wondered if Shin was trying to pick a fight with him. Ta then called out to Tar, asking him to use his weapon and not destroy any more of the poor, fragile weapons. Ta was surprised when Shin materialized a weapon with a single gesture. Not only was Shin a weapon maker, but he was extremely skilled and competent, far beyond the average. Ta couldn't understand why someone so talented was acting as a helper. Ta had heard that low-grade supporters often took on helper roles because they were low on money. Shin took Ta's weapon and mentioned that there would be a condition. Once Ta cleared and left the dungeon, he had to forget everything about Shin's skills and Shin himself. Ta raised an eyebrow, asking if Shin thought he could forget just because he wanted him to. Shin replied that if Ta didn't agree, he could just go ahead and smash all his high-class weapons. Ta thought for a moment he knew that the weapon would probably break the moment Shin used a skill on it, but having more weapons couldn't hurt. So Ta agreed, promising he would forget about it. Shin smiled, saying that was great, and told him to go ahead and go wild. Ta rushed to attack the lizard man, flaring his sword and breaking the monster's weapon. Shin watched in surprise, thinking that Ta was only planning to deflect the attack, but instead the opponent's weapon was destroyed first. Ta's control over his weapon was far beyond what Shin had expected. He wondered if Ta's weapon was just that much stronger. Shin, intrigued, thought to himself that the weapon maker must be capable of manifesting a weapon that was at least B rank on the spot. This was getting interesting. Shin then decided to test just how capable the weapon was and cranked up the power. He stabbed the lizard man using Fire Blast as well. After that, he jumped behind the lizard man, stabbing the weapon into its head and releasing another blast of fire. The lizard man spat out green blood as it fell, and Tao stood there, his weapon, the one made by Shin, covered in the blood. He looked at the weapon in surprise, noticing that there wasn't a single scratch on it. Just as he was about to think further, the newbies from his guild appeared, calling out to him. They thanked him, saying that it was because of Ta that they were alive and saved. Ta replied, relieved that none of them seemed badly hurt. They told him that they couldn't even fight with their own weapons, but thanks to Shin, they had been able to hold out. Ta then turned to Shin and asked for his name. Shin wondered why Ta would want to know the name of a helper. Ta replied that they should at least know each other's names. He then introduced himself. Finally, Shin approached and introduced himself as well. He said he would leave the magic stones at the dungeon's entrance. The others agreed, but Tai asked Shin to come along with him to the boss room. Shin replied that he was just a helper. Tai insisted, explaining that the dungeon had already turned into an error dungeon, which meant that if they didn't defeat the boss, no one would be able to leave whether they were a helper or a supporter. Shin responded, mentioning that Tar was more capable of taking down the boss. Tai stated that, as Shin had seen earlier, no other weapon could handle his skills. No matter how skilled Shin was, wasn't it pointless if he just smashed the weapon Shin had made for him? Shin replied that the weapons he made wouldn't break. Ted countered, saying that was what Shin thought, but this was an error-class dungeon. The creatures inhabiting this place were far beyond the average lizard man. And if the boss was just as strong, no amount of caution they took would be excessive. Shin agreed and started moving, his steps echoing as he followed Ta. When they reached the boss room, they saw the Lizard King and another lizard man. Ta suggested that it would be better for Shin to ignore any previous danger levels or information he had and focus on putting an end to it as quickly as possible. He warned that if they took too long, his weapon might snap in two. Shin again assured him the weapon wouldn't break, and if Ta didn't believe him, he could always test it out himself. The Lizard King commanded his minion to attack, and the lizard lunged forward with its paw. However, Shin and Ta skillfully dodged the strike. Ta then charged with his sword, but the lizard used its power to overwhelm him with intense pressure. Ta was disoriented, unable to comprehend what was happening. As he leaped into the air, the Lizard King jumped as well, attempting to strike Ta's weapon. After the clash, Ta was sent flying into the sky. The Lizard King swiftly climbed onto the lizard's head, and the creature unleashed a powerful flame attack toward Ta. Just in time, Shin created a protective shield barrier around Ta. The lizard retaliated, knocking Shin back. Ta, still in the air, turned to Shin and asked that wasn't he the one who makes weapons. Shin replied that a shield can be a weapon too and didn't get hit by one before. Ta flared his sword, promising that once they get out of there, he had plenty of questions for Shin. The Lizard King then conjured a long chain to strike Ta. However, Ta effortlessly stopped the chain with his fist, causing it to wrap around his sword. As the Lizard King tugged on the chain, Ta was pulled closer. Shin, urging Ta to focus, said to stop playing around and fight properly. In response, a second sword materialized in Ta's other hand. Ta, noticing the new weapon, questioned that didn't Shin tell me to test him, so shouldn't it be something for a pet? The weapon captured by the chain vanished, and Ta used his second weapon to strike the lizard with several swift slashes as he closed in. The Lizard King watched intently, but Ta threw his sword at him, followed by a powerful kick that sent him reeling backward. Furious, Ta leaped into the air, his sword flaring with energy as he prepared to attack again. The Lizard King, now focused on Shin, attempted to strike him, but a transparent barrier appeared, protecting him. Shin, growing angrier, wonders if the Lizard King really think he can threaten me with webs. Ta, equally enraged, stood ready for the next move. After a while, the entrance to the dungeon, which had been glowing red, shifted to a calm blue. Outside, people began to wonder if the dungeon had been cleared. As the group emerged, reporters rushed over to Ta, bombarding him with questions about the dungeon's interior, the boss monster, and whether everyone had been saved. Men approached Ta, asking if he was injured. Ta reassured him, saying that he was completely fine. The hunters surrounding him praised his efforts, with one girl mentioning that if it weren't for him, they would all have perished. Shin, meanwhile, handed the team leader a bag of magic stones, explaining that he had already received his payment in advance and was leaving. The team leader expressed his gratitude for Shin's hard work. Without acknowledging Ta, Shin silently left the area. The reporters then turned to Ta, eager to know how he managed to clear the dungeon so quickly. They suggested that the dungeon must have been easy for him. Ta shook his head in disagreement, and just as he was about to mention Shin's role, he realized that Shin had already gone. A girl then spoke up, commenting that while everyone else had been blocking and working together, Ta had handled the majority of the threats on his own. She asked Ta how everything had gone. A boy chimed in, expressing that all of their weapons had been destroyed and he had no idea how dangerous the situation was. He added that if it weren't for Ta, they would have all been wiped out long ago. Ta, slightly confused, asked the boy what he was talking about. He explained that when it came to the weapons, it was thanks to the person who had been crafting them for the group, which allowed them to last as long as they did. The boy apologized, and Ta then inquired about the support who had come as a helper and weapon maker. The boy seemed unsure about the weapon maker, acknowledging that the helper was indeed a support role, but wondered if that person had any special abilities. The girl replied that she wasn't sure about that. Tay, still puzzled, asked the others that didn't them all see how that helper made the weapons. The others were confused, wondering if he was referring to the pickaxe. Tad didn't believe that person even carried a pickaxe, but he had brought it and used it, though they must have lost it along the way. Tad then realized that the person had mined all the mana stones. As Ta wondered what was happening, he remembered that they had all received weapons from the same person, yet it felt as if they had forgotten that fact. He recalled Shin giving him a sword and telling him to forget everything related to his abilities. Ta then thought about the rental pay and how the person had used a skill exclusive to a rank or higher makers. Just then, a man called out to him, and Min noticed something was off. Ta handed a container to the man, then turned and left to search for Shin, wondering where he had gone and if he had already left. Meanwhile, Shin had been hiding while Tay searched for him. Min and the man approached, asking Ta what was wrong. Tay called out to Min, telling her he needed her to find someone for him. As Ta sat in his guild office, Min arrived with information about Shin's location. Around 10 o'clock that same day, Shin, accompanied by a 5-member team, had entered a D-rank dungeon near Sampa. Ta nodded in agreement, mentioning that Sampa wasn't too far away. Min then hesitated before asking him something. She mentioned that she had a question that why he was so interested in a D-rank maker like Shin. Ta pondered for a moment, wondering if that's what it seemed like to her. He thought about how, on the surface, it was easy to dismiss Shin based on his status and background, which clearly indicated he was a D-rank. But Ta knew better. The rental pay skill alone disproved everything. The level of skill in that ability was beyond anything Ta had seen before. It wasn't just some ordinary skill, it was something with the potential to bring about great fortune. Yet it seemed that Shin was using it only to conceal his true identity. A weapon maker with such talents could easily reach a level far higher than D rank, and Ta was certain he would understand more when he finally met Shin again. At that moment, he would no longer feel the same doubt. Ta would be able to use his full power without worrying about the weapons breaking. Over the years, he had encountered countless blacksmiths who were considered great artisans, but none of their creations had ever met his expectations. He had tested the weapons of renowned blacksmiths, but every single one had eventually broken, unable to withstand his power. To make matters worse, the weapon-making abilities of most creators were limited to traditional forms of weapons. But Shin's abilities were clearly something different. But the weapons created by Shin far exceeded the limitations of ordinary abilities and weapon forms. It was as if those limitations simply didn't exist. With Shin's abilities, even the most difficult feats were possible things that he hadn't been able to accomplish before simply because he lacked the right weapon. Tay considered the usual clearing time for a D-rank dungeon by a 5-member party. It typically took around 4 hours, and they had only 1 hour left. He then turned to Min and asked about his schedule for the day. She informed him that at 7 o'clock p.m., he had a meeting with the guild master, Kyunmu. Tay decided to leave, instructing Min to cancel the meeting as he needed to leave ahead of time. He wanted to avoid any chance of missing Shin. The scene shifted to the dungeon where a boy in armor had just defeated a boss. He was in shock, realizing that the ribbon used by the helper was indeed made by Shin. If such mana could destroy a boss weapon, Shin must surely be at least B rank. When the man's weapon shattered into 2 pieces, the boy thought they were done for. But to his surprise, he hadn't anticipated that the person who had entered as a mere helper would possess such an incredible ability. He marveled at the quality of Shin's work, admitting he had never seen anything like it before. Grateful, he thanked Shin, acknowledging that if it weren't for his help, they would have failed. He suggested that they should recruit him. A girl nearby agreed, commenting that it was a shame Shin was still going around as just a helper. The boy agreed, commenting that Shin certainly had a good eye for this kind of thing. Shin, however, was deep in thought. He realized he had used more mana than he would anticipated. He hadn't expected to encounter a party struggling so much, especially since it wasn't an era dungeon. As he began collecting the magic stones, he thought if only he had just a little more mana left back then, things wouldn't have gone so poorly. He recalled the intense heat that had filled the dungeon earlier, especially after defeating the golem. Once he had used up all his mana, the heat dissipated and never returned. The mana he felt now was no more powerful than that of a typical D-rank awakener. Still, there was a relief that he hadn't encountered any major problems while crafting the weapons. Shin also reflected on how his fast life memory had helped him in ways he hadn't expected. The maker's basic skill, creating, was designed to aid in the creation of specific objects. It was a highly intuitive skill, where the quality of the item created was directly proportional to the mana used. However, there was still one unknown aspect, another method that could enhance the performance of the skill, which Shin hadn't yet uncovered. What he did know was that the deeper his understanding of the object he was crafting, the higher the quality of the creation. The most remarkable aspect of the ability was that, as the quality of the item increased, the efficiency of the mana used also improved, This meant that even when using the same amount of mana to create identical objects, the quality would vary meaningfully based on the creator's level of understanding. After his hidden ability was revealed, Shin found himself reflecting on the various training he had undergone. He remembered his horse training, the material research, the lessons he received from a hunter as a support, and his time spent in the workshop learning the intricacies of crafting. Despite all this, the excitement he felt was more intense than he had expected. He continued mining, thinking that while he didn't know exactly how much better his abilities would become, he knew that, in comparison to the mana he was using, the quality was improving. However, it was clear that there were still limitations both in crafting and in using the rental pay skill. The process was still clunky, and he struggled to use both abilities effectively at the same time. As he gathered the magic stones, he thought about how expensive mana-related equipment was. That was why, for the time being, he couldn't afford to purchase any of it. Please, just a few more mana points, he thought, knowing that mana-related items were among the few things that could be mass-produced. He made a mental note to order more potions. Although his earnings as a helper were modest, he was still struggling to get by. No one would accept a D-rank maker as a full-time support, so he didn't have many options. But at least the results of his efforts were promising, and for that, he was relieved. He opened his status window and saw that there was only a small amount left until he reached his mana absorption goal. About 20% remained. He realized that a few dungeon clears wouldn't be enough. A single man clear only contributed just over 1% of the total mana, and the efficiency was far too low. The only remaining option, it seemed, was to enter in a rank error dungeon. To absorb a large amount of mana at once, entering the ranker dungeon was the only method. Unlike other dungeons, it allowed for significantly more mana absorption, which was exactly what he had been seeking. The problem was that he couldn't predict the difficulty of the ranker dungeon before entering. It would have been tough without Ta's presence, as the previous experience had proven. He concluded that there would likely be at least a C-rank boss, and so he needed to prepare accordingly. The only way to grow as a D-ranked awakener for now was to focus on the rewards gained from mana absorption. The team leader acknowledged their efforts and appreciated their work. As they were leaving, he mentioned they would meet again in the future. Shin felt satisfied that he had created lasting memories with them. Just then, Tae caught up to him and asked if Shin remembered him. Shin realized his efforts hadn't had much impact, and in response he asked Ta if he would believe him if he said he didn't. Ta responded by handing him a card, and Shin inquired what kind of work Ta wanted from him. Ta explained that he had something important to discuss, which was why he was asking for a little of Shin's time. When Shin saw the Overkill Guild name on the card, he recognized it as one of the top 3 guilds in Korea. He knew he wasn't in a position to get involved with such a prestigious guild yet, so he needed to find a way to politely decline. Shin claimed he didn't have any time, mentioning a prior dinner appointment. However, as he tried to leave, Tad placed a hand on his shoulder and insisted that Shin wouldn't regret the conversation. Tag assured him it would be quick and even offered to treat him to dinner. Shin retorted, noting that as the guild master, Ta must have plenty of time, unlike a low-ranked supporter like him. Tai admitted this was true. Shin wasn't thrilled about it, but he realized he needed to gauge how much the rental fee had affected Ta. Reluctantly, he agreed to talk for a while. The 3 of them went to a traditional house for dinner, and Shin asked what business the guild master of the Overkill Guild could possibly have with a D-ranked supporter like him. He suspected it was simply because Ta had too much free time and wanted to make small talk. Ta, however, explained that, as Shin had noticed, his class was Berserker. While this granted him overwhelming attack power, it also came with a limitation of menial weapon capable of withstanding the immense force. For a Berserker, finding a weapon supplier that could match their needs was crucial, and Ta had been searching for one tirelessly. He had visited countless places both within and outside the country. From the best blacksmiths to the most renowned weapon makers in the field, he had left no stone unturned. If there was even the slightest chance that a weapon could meet his requirements, he would commission it without hesitation, regardless of time or cost. However, every weapon he had used up until then had been unable to withstand his full power except for one, the sword created by Shin. Shin realized then that the rental pay hadn't had any effect on Tag, and he didn't believe there was a nullification skill in the Berserker class. Tae's careless confidence made Shin wary. He knew he would need to be cautious when using such a strategy with higher-level hunters. Tae, sensing the change in Shin's demeanor, decided to be more direct. He asked if Shin would be interested in joining his guild. Knowing that Shin wasn't currently affiliated with any guild, Tae promised that, if he joined, Shin would receive the best possible treatment. Tae offered Shin a contract fee of 10 billion, along with separate payments for operational expenses and dividends. The contract would be for 1 year, and each time it was extended, the fees would increase by 10%. As he was about to explain that the exact details would be in the contract, Shin quickly apologized, explaining that he had no intention of joining a guild and would have to decline the offer. With that, Ta had no further discussion to offer. Shin stood up to leave and thanked him for the meal. Ta called out to him once more, but Shin didn't stop. Min, who had been quietly observing, asked Ta why he had made such an offer to Shin. There seemed to be no clear reason for it, yet the conditions were trivial. Ta responded by saying that if Min were to face a situation like Shin's, she wouldn't question the offer. He continued, mentioning that while the weapon Shin had created hadn't fully reached its potential, it was the first one that felt like it could withstand everything he had to give. Min hesitated, still unsure, but Ta pressed on. It wasn't just about the sensation of the weapon itself. He asked her to consider the total sum of all the high-level weapons he had destroyed over the past year. Min realized then that the guild master's expenses on weapons were astronomical, especially when factoring in the cost of those weapons being destroyed because they couldn't handle the pressure. If the weapon wasn't above a certain rank, his abilities wouldn't even be able to be fully unleashed. Min then remarked that, if that were the case, the contract fee Ta offered would mean very little. However, the issue up until now had been that no one, not even those considered the best in the field, had been able to craft a weapon that could withstand such power. Ta responded by explaining that the fact Shin had this ability was exactly why he wanted to recruit him at any cost, regardless of the offer he made. Shin, as he walked away, thought to himself that there might come a day when he would have to turn down an offer from one of the top 3 guilds, the Overkill Guild, and from Tagian himself. While it was a tempting offer, he knew it was still too early for him. He decided to wait patiently, certain that Ta would come back to him again. The scene then shifted to a dungeon where several goblins were being slain. Suddenly, one boy's arm was severed by a mysterious figure. Another boy, witnessing this, asked the man who he was. The man wielded a giant sword, and his actions were so striking that they would be remembered for a long time. At a moment like this, most people would be whining or begging for their lives, losing consciousness from the pain. But this person, the one who would eventually become a hero, was different. He stabbed the first boy, killing him without hesitation. The second boy, stunned and confused, wondered what had just happened. Was the man trying to kill them all and take their trophies? The man, not concerned with such a mundane reason, responded that it wasn't his intention to explain himself. He saw it as a waste of energy to explain anything to someone who was about to die. But he would share everything if the boy managed to defeat him, so he would better hurry and try. The boy realized the man was not an easy opponent. At this ambiguous distance, he would surely die. So he resolved to either lose an arm or a leg in an attempt to fight back. He charged at the man, but the man blocked the attack effortlessly with his massive sword and swung it back with such force that the boy's sword was sent flying into the air. The boy was stunned. The man then kicked the boy with such strength that he was knocked back. He muttered that it was so disappointing, and excited by the fight, the man said it was his first hero-ranked subjugation in a year. However, to think that the boy was such an insignificant opponent was a letdown. Still, he commended the bravery it took for the boy to challenge him. The boy, now on the ground and realizing his fate, pleaded for his life. The man coldly replied that he would send the boy off cleanly, and with that, slashed him dead. As the boy fell lifeless, the man moved forward, reflecting that he had hoped for a more challenging fight. It hadn't even served as a decent warm-up. The boy had worn an unfair expression in his last moments, but there was no need for concern. The report would make it clear that they had fought valiantly against the boss and died heroically. He tossed the dead body of the boy aside, remarking that this was a common occurrence in a rancor dungeon. He checked the collection of photos of the deceased, saying that his collection was growing, and that he lived for moments like this. The only thing that felt strange to him were the heals. The energy they gave off unsettled him. He told her to hide them for now, or at least make it less obvious when the priestess arrived. She emerged, apologizing for the delay, explaining that she had come in haste because there were precious ingredients nearby. He raised an eyebrow, wondering what could possibly be so valuable, but he dismissed it, thinking that all those people were idiots. That's why he had warned her not to listen to the priestess and to wait a little longer. She wondered aloud about his words and asked if he was implying that he wanted to go against the wishes of the executor. He scoffed and referred to the executor as a sensitive bastard, explaining that he was simply suggesting they clean up the situation first. She offered to handle it, assuring him it was her specialty. He reminded her not to forget their promise that she would let him face an S-rank hunter, and that was the only reason he had been associating with her. He also added that he hadn't been able to fully unleash his power yet and wanted the opportunity to do so without any hesitation. She agreed, reassuring him not to worry as she would contact him soon. She tore open the belly of the dead body, wondering what would emerge next. Suddenly, a monster appeared from within the corpse. Her eyes lit up with excitement as she called it the child, confirming that the executor had been right after all. The scene shifted to a portal where a group of hunters was gathered. Shin approached a man who was concealing his face with a mask and carrying a weapon case. He was visibly surprised when he saw the man, and it was none other than Ta. Ta seemed just as surprised to see Shin and wondered aloud why he was there. Shin asked him why he had come, and Ta replied with a grin, noting that Shin had a good eye for recognizing him. Shin explained that he only knew one person who carried a weapon case like that and then asked Tai again why he was there. Tai responded that he was there to attack the gate. Shin raised an eyebrow and asked why a D-rank gate, of all things. Tai explained that the guild member who was supposed to enter had suddenly fallen ill, so he was filling in as their substitute. Before Shin could say anything more, a man called out to them, urging everyone to head inside. Tai turned to Shin and said to let's get going. As they began to move, Shin couldn't help but think to himself that he knew Ta would show up eventually, but he hadn't expected him to be so quick. Now he would have to adjust his plans accordingly. They all finally entered and Ta turned to Shin, asking why he had refused to join the guild. Shin replied that he had already rejected the offer and didn't want to discuss it any further. A boy asked a girl if she had heard about the auction for the C-rank gate that had taken place that morning in Chunshin. The girl confirmed and the boy told her he had heard that the Hyunmoon Guild had acquired it in one go. She agreed, mentioning that her friend was there and had heard that the bidding had reached such a high price that no one else dared to compete. Shin, overhearing this, thought to himself that the Hyunmoon Guild had purchased a C-rank gate, and he wondered if they had found something special inside. Ta then asked Shin if he was interested in buying gates himself. He explained that if Shin joined their guild, he would be able to easily acquire special gates above B rank, as there were certain privileges that came with the guild's name. Shin reflected on Ta's words. To most Awakeners, the name of their guild was of utmost importance. It not only brought them the envy and admiration of the public, but also granted them opportunities for other lucrative jobs, along with incomparable revenue and rewards. Furthermore, their vested rights within the guild allowed them access to countless privileges. For high-level special gates, the guild members could secure entrance tickets, and their influence wasn't determined solely by talent. Political connections played a major role in gaining access to these opportunities. This structure meant that rare treasures, those that could be earned through such gates, would naturally fall into the hands of the larger guilds. Tae told Shin that, as an awakened, he must have a goal he was working towards. Whatever that goal was, with the backing of Overkill, it would be easier for Shin to achieve. He couldn't understand why Shin would reject such an offer. Shin coldly responded that it was none of Tae's business. He vaguely knew what he was doing, and since there was probably never been anyone who had rejected an offer from the Overkill Guild, he wanted to make it clear, no matter what, he was not going to join any guild. Ta wondered aloud if Shin's rejection was due to some trauma from the annihilation of the Doan Guild, which he had read about in the report, or if there was another reason. Whatever it was, Tae wasn't going to give up so easily. As they continued ahead, a boy was visibly frightened by the sight of spider webs covering the ceiling. They pressed on, and soon the man spoke up, telling them that they were about to enter the monster's territory. Noticing the group's inexperience, he quickly began to explain the situation. He started by confirming that they had all received the reconnaissance report. The monsters they would face were legion spiders. The level of difficulty for each individual spider was low, but their special traits made them a threat. These spiders lived in groups, and the reconnaissance report indicated that there were approximately 50 of them, which wasn't an overwhelming number. However, they possessed paralysis poison in their fangs, so the man warned them to be careful not to get bitten. Ta heard a sound and quickly told everyone that the monsters were coming soon, urging them to stick close to him. Shin, unfazed, replied that they didn't need to worry about the support and helpers. They should just prepare for the fight. Ta, however, addressed the team's competency, reminding them that it was essential to protect the support and helpers. It was a rule hunters had to follow, no matter their abilities, situation, or whether they agreed with it. Shin scoffed, telling him that no hunter would be foolish enough to follow such a rule. Just then, someone mentioned that the spiders were approaching. A boy holding a sword was visibly trembling, but he was trying to calm himself. He reminded the others that they could defeat the spiders if they stuck to what they had learned. As one spider jumped toward them, the boy swung his sword, effortlessly slicing it down in a single slash. Another boy used his shield to protect himself, while the girl with the magic staff cast spells, attacking the spiders with bursts of energy. Ta thought to himself that, for a D-rank team, their performance wasn't bad, and he didn't have to worry about them too much. Shin, however, was taken aback when he saw the large group of spiders. He hadn't expected it to be more than a few dozen. As the spiders rushed to attack, Ta drew a fire-based weapon and began fighting back, thinking that the durability of each legion spider was fairly low, even among ranked monsters. He realized that even without using the blade itself, all they needed to do was release a bit of sword ki to defeat them. At this rate, he would be able to finish the raid without even losing a weapon. Suddenly, Shin heard a few hunters calling for help, as the river was surrounded by a large number of spiders. The boy with the shield warned that the spiders wouldn't stop coming and that there were only a few hunters who had done the reconnaissance. The second boy mentioned that things were going to get rough, and the girl with the magic staff was also reaching her limit with her mana. Tae glanced at Shin and suggested they move toward the trouble. He then told Shin to follow him. Shin, however, responded that Ta should go ahead and help while he finished handling things on his side. Ta was surprised by Shin's reaction, but before he could respond, a spider jumped at Shin. Ta shouted for him to get down, realizing that Shin could easily get caught up in the attack if Ta used his sword recklessly. But Shin quickly reacted, opening his eyes and shaping his power into a square form above the spider. With a swift movement, he launched his attack, killing the spider instantly. The creature collapsed at his feet. Shin thought to himself that, of all the weapons he could currently make, the sword was the one with the greatest craftsmanship. It would be the most effective for dealing multiple hits and pouring power into them all at once, something that would be impossible with his current mana reserves. But if he could harness his power in this way, there was nothing better. Shin focused his energy, directing it like a sword, and with a swift motion he launched it at all the spiders in his vicinity, cutting them down in a single strike. Tat watched, surprised, as Shin stood atop the head of one of the fallen spiders, his movements calm and precise. The sword had been stabbed into the spider's body, and Tat was surprised by the wide area of attack. He thought the battle must have lasted at least 10 seconds, that Shin managed to deal with all the dozens of Legion spiders in that short time. Ta wondered if Shin used materialization in the fight, but quickly dismissed the thought after all. Shin was a talented support who could hold his own. Shin, on the other hand, was wondering what Ta was doing and decided to go help the others. He saw that the three of them were surrounded by spiders and the creatures were getting closer. Ta realized the situation wasn't looking great, and they would talk properly once everything was resolved. Shin pointed to his bag, signaling Ta to take care of the situation as people might not believe that a helper could do such things. Ta quickly rushed in with his sword and started attacking the spiders. After he defeated them, a man thanked Ta for his help, saying they wouldn't have made it without him. The man was a little surprised, though, as he hadn't expected Ta to be the guild master of Overkill Guild. Ta apologized for not revealing his identity earlier, but mentioned he was just quietly investigating the dungeon. The girl was shocked by his apology. She couldn't believe they would survive because of him. Watching him take down the spiders with such skill was so cool, and she even asked if she could take a picture with him once he was free. Someone came by and interrupted, and the girl quickly saw this as her chance to approach. The boy holding a lantern and Shin showed up, apologizing for being late. They started collecting the byproducts as they went. After exploring the area, they found that there were no other masters around, and they figured out how to go even deeper. The boy in armor suggested that they shouldn't continue the raid any longer. It was unfortunate, but he thought they should call it off. The first boy, not understanding, asked why they had to stop when there wasn't much left. The boy in armor explained that the number of Legion spiders and the geography of the dungeon were completely different from what the reconnaissance report had shown. He went on to say that the dungeon existed past gates that separated it from their world. These dungeons were home to bizarre creatures and landscapes that couldn't be found on Earth. The whole concept of dungeons and the Awakened weren't fully understood yet. For the newly awakened, the most important thing was information about the dungeon. Unfortunately, not many awakened individuals could adjust to environments they would never encounter before. This meant that failing the raid, especially in a worst-case scenario, could lead to death. That's why the role of scouts had become so vital. The Awakened with the ability to detect or hide their traces started gathering and taking on dungeon reconnaissance commissions. As a result, the dungeon clear rate began to rise significantly, and these individuals came to be known as scouts. The boy in armor explained that the accuracy of these recon reports was usually above 98%, so it was unlikely that this situation was just a mistake. However, they couldn't rule out the possibility that it was a rank error in the dungeon. The second boy hesitated for a moment, suggesting that since they had Ta, wouldn't it be okay to continue the raid? The armored boy responded that he understood the boy's desire to press on, but they had already received Ta's help once, and if they weren't careful, they could all end up in danger. The boy, determined to clear the dungeon and with his own reasons for wanting to continue, asked if there was any other way. The girl seemed to feel the same way. The armored boy questioned if their reason was really more important than their lives. Once they entered the boss room, there would be no turning back, and he didn't want that to be the case for any of them. He suggested they exit first and report to the association. Ta, however, said he was fine to continue. Even though he was there to investigate, he was still part of the team. If the raid progress could help him come to a conclusion, then there was no reason not to keep going. And if he wanted to investigate further, the boss room was the place to be. The armored boy bowed toward Ta, shamelessly thanking him for agreeing to continue. Then he started to talk about being the leader, but Ta just told him not to worry about him and to continue leading as they had from the start. The boy agreed, saying to let's get going and asked everyone to follow him. The five of them moved forward and soon found themselves in front of a gate. The leader, sensing they were at the boss room, said he would do a final briefing. He explained that the dungeon's boss was the Legion Queen leader with a danger level of D+. Her overall battle ability was low, so she was considered an easy boss, mainly focused on breeding Legion spiders. However, that was just the original intel, and they had no idea what lay behind the door. He gave a final nod, saying to let's head inside. The girl created some light to help them see, but Tae couldn't sense anything unusual. The leader warned them to be cautious since it was the boss room. They soon spotted the queen spider and a few others nearby, as well as a boy dressed like a spider, the one mentioned in the briefing. The girl breathed a sigh of relief, noting that the boss looked exactly as expected. She planned to attack first with lightning magic, and her strike caused the queen spider to fall to the ground. The leader wondered if the boss was already dead, but you had never heard of such a thing before. Something had changed, so he quickly ordered everyone to retreat. Suddenly, they heard a disturbing sound, and a very deadly spider with a human-like upper body appeared. It was an Arachne. Tad immediately prepared to strike, realizing that a B-rank monster had appeared. He knew that his sloppy swordsmanship wouldn't leave a scratch on it, so he had to make sure his first blow did the most damage possible. He was about to deliver a fatal strike when, to his surprise, his weapon broke into pieces mid-swing. As he was sent flying through the air, Tae realized his sword was destroyed and he couldn't deliver the finishing blow. Just as the Arachne was about to attack, Shin quickly created a temporary weapon for Tae, telling him to buy some time until he could forge a proper weapon. Shin was using up his mana, but it wasn't working at all. He started to wonder if he had drained it completely. It was amazing that he had lasted this long with his current mana levels. Thanks to the potions, he was able to keep going, but he could only drink one bottle a day anymore, and they could become addictive. After drinking the potion, he noticed the effects were still good, but it was too late for him to make a proper weapon. He began crafting it, thinking about how the Arachne was a high-level B-rank monster, while the error boss that should have appeared was the C-rank monarch spider. They were incredibly lucky that Ta had joined them. Without him, it would have been nearly impossible to face the Arachne with their current group. When the danger level hit B, everything changed and the fight became much harder. The Arachne was battling Ta, who was surrounded by flares. Shin thought to himself that his fighting power was equal to 5 A-rank hunters. Given the Arachne's abilities, they couldn't rely on Ta alone. He turned to the others and told them to get ready. They should be able to move now since the Arachne's killing intent had shifted targets. The leader of the party wondered who Shin was. The second boy questioned why someone so talented was participating as a helper. The girl wondered if Shin had come along with Ta. Shin ignored their questions and told them that they had something to deal with first. He then quickly made 3 weapons based on the abilities of the 3. He told them to pick up the weapons in front of them and either raid the dungeon by defeating the spiders or run away and wait outside until the situation cleared up. Shin trusted that they would make the right decision. As more spiders rushed toward them, the boy slashed through them with the sword, amazed by how powerful it felt. He had never wielded such a weapon before. With each slash, it felt like cutting through paper, and even wondered if killing monsters was always this easy. The girl, using high-level magic, attacked all of them at once. The leader watched in surprise, realizing that the only thing that had changed was the weapon, yet the power of her skills had increased several times over. He wondered if the weapon Shin made was really that good and who exactly Shin was. Taz's sword was now covered in green blood from the high-level monsters, and he found it a bit tough to buy time. As the Arachne came charging to attack, Ta thought to himself that he needed to finish this as quickly as possible. He rushed in with his sword, slashing down the Arachne, and to his surprise, the sword held up fine. He realized it was much stronger than before, just like Shin had explained. Suddenly, a wave of spider heads appeared, and the girl wondered where they had come from and where they were going. The leader quickly figured it out. The spiders were heading straight for Ta. Ta told everyone to back up. He suspected that the Arachne had hidden these spiders, and things were getting more complicated. He also realized that the Arachne's abilities were activating. As the spiders reached the Arachne, Tae understood what was happening. The Arachne was sacrificing the spiders to transfer their life energy to herself, effectively reviving her. He realized that the Arachne would keep coming back unless they killed all of the spiders. Tae rushed in to attack again, thinking that he needed to increase his firepower and finish the battle in one blow. As the flares burned on his sword, it started to break apart, which made Ta worry. Shin, watching, commented that Tae was more amazing than he had thought. Even though Shin had made the sword with his barely remaining mana, he never expected Ta to actually destroy it. Shin quickly made another sword, telling Ta to use it. This one wasn't the single-edged sword Ta was used to. It was the most durable weapon Shin could create. As soon as Tae grasped it, he could feel its strength. With this new weapon, he was confident he could defeat them all in one strike. He coated the sword with his flares and prepared to strike. He mentioned that he would be a bit unfamiliar with two-handed sword combat, but it seemed like the right choice for the situation. He lifted the sword and delivered an explosive slash at the Arachne, landing a devastating blow. Shin realized that the explosion was likely an innate skill of a berserker. It was probably the first time Ta had used the skill properly. Normally, this skill caused the user to lose their rationality in exchange for overwhelming power. Ta cut the Arachne clean in two and thought to himself that it would have been difficult to handle the aftermath if the weapon had shattered. Ta felt the danger of the situation. If he hadn't released all of his power, his rationality might have been consumed, and that was the second time since his awakening that it had nearly happened. He realized he had used his skill properly this time, but it was still unsettling. As he looked at Shin, he understood that Shin was no ordinary awakened. The moment his abilities were discovered, the whole world would focus on him. They stood there looking at the dead body of the Araxian, which radiated an overwhelming amount of mana. It was nothing like any other dungeon-era boss they had encountered. Shin called out to Ta, asking if he felt anything from the corpse. Ta shook his head, replying that the boss wasn't dead yet. Since they had gotten rid of all the remnants, it wouldn't be able to come back to life. Shin agreed, thinking that even high-grade hunters couldn't sense the mana the way they had. Suddenly, Tae's passive skill, mana absorption, activated. As he read the description on his screen, he discovered that he had also obtained a new skill, demonic weapon production. Tae was curious about this new skill. He read more about it, but he couldn't even imagine what kind of demonic weapons it might produce. He didn't remember anything specific about the demonic realm, though it was something they all knew of in some way. It was a bit disappointing that there were no mana-related rewards, but he shrugged it off. It was fine. Tae realized that, thanks to the Araxian, he had already reached half of the mana he needed, and it didn't seem like the rewards would stop there. He called Shin over, waving his hand, and told him he had something to say. Shin, curious, asked what it was. Tae bowed deeply and began by apologizing. Regardless of his refusal, Tae admitted that it had been impolite of him to ask Shin to join their guild both as a person and as a guild master. He offered his sincere apologies. Shin was taken aback by this sudden change. The leader of the party was equally shocked to see Ta bowing to Shin, a D-ranked helper. But then again, considering Shin's earlier abilities, it was clear he wasn't just any normal person. The leader thought that Shin might actually be a hidden talent of the Overkill Guild. The boy and girl arrived, with the boy mentioning that they had searched everywhere and there were no remnants left. The girl added that she thought the Araxian must have taken all the monsters in the dungeon earlier. The boy looked impressed and remarked that the weapon was amazing. It sliced through monsters without the need for any energy. The girl agreed, saying she had never heard of a weapon maker like that before and wondered if Shin was somehow related to the Overkill Guild. The leader motioned for them to leave and contact the association. The boy, still curious, asked if there was any particular reason they should leave so soon. The girl agreed, saying she wanted to thank Ta and the helper first. The leader turned to them and quickly urged them to leave the area, calling it a disgusting place. The boy agreed and asked him to stop rushing them. As they were leaving, the leader glanced back, thinking it was clear that the helper must be connected to the guild. It was good to leave now without attracting any unwanted attention or getting involved with the affairs of a big guild. Things would only get tiring for them. However, he couldn't help but think that no matter the emergency situation, revealing that kind of power so easily was different from what a big guild would usually do. Such guilds tended to emphasize security and caution. Shin agreed with the leader, mentioning that even though Ta had used the rental pay, it was strange to see him bowing his head to just anyone. Ta then spoke up, telling them that the guild wouldn't bother Shin anymore. He wouldn't follow him around, but that didn't mean they were giving up. It was his first real opportunity, and he wanted to make a contract. He promised that Shin would like the terms. The next morning, Shin arrived at the Overkill Guild and met Min. She greeted him warmly, saying it was nice to see him again. She introduced herself as the attending secretary of the guild and said she was in charge of the contract proceedings for the day. She handed him a document to sign. Shin thanked her, mentioning that Ta had said he would contact him right away, but he hadn't expected it to be the next morning. Min explained that Ta had told her to proceed with everything as quickly as possible. Shin wondered what this was all about and felt like things were getting more serious than he had anticipated. Min mentioned that the room they were in was a special reception area inside the guild, one with particularly strict security. She reassured him that if he was worried about any leaks, there was no need to be concerned. She handed him a paper, explaining that it was the contract with the conditions Ta had discussed with him inside the dungeon. She added that while it would take some time, the contents of the contract could be changed if necessary, so he should feel comfortable sharing his thoughts. As Shin looked at the document, he realized it was exactly as Ta had described in the dungeon, and it felt much more real seeing it organized like this. He set the paper down and told Min that there was no issue, so they could proceed. He reflected on his conversation with Ta in the dungeon, where Ta had mentioned that he would be an unofficial supporter. Although it was just a guess, Shin now vaguely understood why Ta had been so reluctant to join a guild. For a number of reasons, he needed to hide his true identity. If that assumption was correct, this offer could be of help. They could secretly supply him with materials he needed, top-tier ingredients, and access to the gates without the usual attention. While the contract would need to be formalized, everything would be handled discreetly. Shin couldn't help but wonder why Ta was being so generous. Ta responded, saying it wasn't for free. He laid out his condition. Shin would need to help him with the commissions he personally assigned. However, Ta clarified that he wouldn't force him. If Shin didn't like the commission, he could refuse. Shin then asked that what if he only take the support and don't help with anything. Ta smiled and told Shin that it was fine. The purpose of the contract, after all, was to establish a connection between Shin and the guild while preventing him from joining any other guilds. Accepting the commission would simply be a token of Shin's sincerity. As they spoke, they heard footsteps approaching, and Ta remarked that it was just the right time. Two men entered the room, one of whom introduced himself as part of the investigation team from the Hunter Association. The second man asked Ta if he was okay. The first man stated that they needed to get going, and that he would hear Ta's response outside. Before they left, Kay turned to Shin and said that he hoped for a positive response. If Shin felt burdened by any of this, he didn't have to accept. Tai added that Shin's abilities were far more valuable than anything in the contract. Shin paused for a moment, reflecting on his original plan. His goal had been to leave a strong impression on Ta and maintain a relationship with the guild without formally joining it. In the end, though, he decided to sign the contract, asking when he would receive the support. Min smiled and pulled out a small box, explaining that Shin could start receiving the support right away. She also told him that if there was anything else he needed, to just let her know. This was a gift from Ta to commemorate the signing of the contract. Min added that she had heard Ta had found something useful in Arachne's room. Shin opened the box slightly before closing it again. He thanked her, placing it carefully in his bag. He then handed her a list of the support materials he needed and asked where he could receive them. Min mentioned that if it was that much, the materials would be available in about a week. However, she added that she might be crossing a line, but she didn't think those materials would be of much help to Shin. Shin agreed, mentioning that he wasn't planning to use them anyway. He stood up, saying he had someone else to meet and needed to leave. He made his way to another building and waited there. As he checked his phone, he noticed it was around the time she was supposed to arrive. Finally, he saw her walking toward him, Jia, and a rank hunter. The scene reminded Shin of the past, back in the forest, where Jia had attacked and killed a monster with ease. It was a time after the player selection, when she was hailed as the hunter prodigy, the god archer. Jia approached the reception desk, excusing herself, and asked for the entrance to the training gate. She showed her card, and the lady behind the desk immediately recognized her as an A-rank hunter. The lady then asked if the C-rank training gate would be acceptable. Jia politely declined and requested the D-rank gate instead. Both the lady and a man at the desk were confused by this. The lady thought to herself that it hadn't been long since Jia was officially recognized as an A-rank awakened. Even so, Jia had very little experience and had only entered a few gates up until that point. The man, too, had seen lower-ranked awakened people give up on the awakened life altogether, but he had never seen an A-rank ask for such a request. For some reason, Jia seemed like she might be demoted. An awakened's rank was initially determined by the amount of mana they could absorb. When the blue energy poured out of the cracks, mana flowed into everyone's bodies, but the amount each person could absorb varied. The more mana a body could hold, the stronger the abilities they could manifest. The association began to analyze the mana levels of each individual, and those who absorbed more than a fixed amount were officially recognized as awakened. From there, they divided people into ranks based on how much mana they could hold, and once assigned a rank, it was generally fixed. Even if someone was of a lower rank, they could improve their performance through dungeon raids. If they were recognized by the association, they could be promoted, and the opposite could happen as well. Jia finished filling out the form and handed it to the lady. The lady told her that she would help her with the association process and asked if Jia had a partner she was planning to go in with. Jia declined. The lady then said she would add Jia to the partner recruitment list, as the rules required at least 2 people to enter together. Since there hadn't been any requests for the D-rank training gate so far, Jia might have to wait a bit. Jia wondered if she could go in alone. The lady replied that it was possible if Jia had a license permit for soloing gates, but it didn't seem like she had registered for that. Jia would need to take a test for it, and the lady asked if she wanted to sign up. Jia declined, saying she would wait instead. The lady then mentioned that Jia's first hunter qualification renewal was coming up in a month. She probably had received the message, but to renew her qualification as an A-rank hunter, she needed to either have several experiences with C-rank or higher gates or pass the A-rank practical test. It seemed like Jia would need to take the test, and she would likely get a message about it soon. The lady wished her the best of luck in passing. Jia thanked her. Jia left, thinking that even requesting a training gate was complicated. She should have just made the request online. She must have been crazy to come in person and deal with so many people. She had come with the mindset that she couldn't get demoted, but now she told herself to get a grip. It was just a D-rank gate, so what happened last time wouldn't happen again. If she took her time and started over, she would be fine. The receptionist asked Jia to wait, but a request had already come through. The rank was D, which was expected, and since Jia was going in alone, it didn't matter. She quickly clicked agree. The scene shifted to a dungeon gate, where Jia arrived, thinking it's been a while since she wore this. It feels so awkward. As she was about to enter, a man named Shin approached her and introduced himself as the supporter, hoping they would get along. Jia bowed to greet him. He apologized for being late and suggested they head inside. Jia agreed, mentioning that she would make the request. Shin thought to himself that Jia was an A-rank hunter who had first been estimated as a rank. However, after a series of failed tests, she was one of the few awakened who had been demoted to C rank. What intrigued him was that Jia, despite everything, had earned the title of God Archer. The reason she had been able to receive such a title was that, after being chosen as a player, she had discovered her hidden talent, and Shin knew exactly what that talent was. It was a talent that could have been discovered even if Jia hadn't become a player, and Shin was determined to help her awaken it that same day. They entered the dungeon world where goblins were roaming through the forest. Jia hid and watched them, wondering if they had left. It was a relief to see real monsters, which made her glad she had brought the equipment that could sense the mana of monsters. She then excused herself to Shin, apologizing for going alone and asking if it was okay for her to take on the monsters by herself. She promised to share all the loot and compensate him as well. Shin reassured her, saying not to worry about him. If she needed help, he could at least provide arrows. Jia thanked him and got into position to attack using her archer skill. She told herself not to be nervous, then took aim at the goblins. As one fell, the others began to charge at her. Jia didn't hesitate and fired another arrow, taking down more goblins. Shin, watching, thought to himself that he hadn't seen her fight like this before, not since she became a player. Her raw destructive power far exceeded that of an A-rank hunter, but it would be meaningless if she couldn't aim. Jia focused, thinking that one of her 3 arrows should hit its mark. With this kind of speed, she would be able to shoot at least 4 more arrows, so she planned to end it with just 2 shots. Jia noticed a goblin playing a bugle, and soon a swarm of goblins surrounded her. She froze, wondering where she should shoot and what she should do next. As the goblins behind her prepared to attack, Shin summoned giant swords to form a protective barrier around her. He approached her, saying he needed her help. Jia was shocked and asked that wasn't he a D-rank maker. He nodded and explained that he couldn't last long on his own, which was why he needed her assistance. Jia was unsure what to do, but Shin moved toward the monsters hiding behind the bushes and told her to use all her remaining power to shoot an arrow. Even though she had no idea what he was planning, Jia agreed. With determination, she aimed and fired a deadly shot in the direction Shin had indicated. She asked if she shouted and wonders what she should do now. Shin smiled and told her that she had opened the path. Now it's time to run. Jia was taken aback, but without hesitation, they both started running. They both reached a cave near the mountain, and Jia wondered if they were really safe. Looking around, she questioned whether they had truly escaped or if they were just hiding from the goblins. She realized that the goblins seemed to have stopped following them, but so much had happened that she couldn't trust her instincts. Still, she couldn't understand why Shin was so calm, but it didn't matter. They needed to get out of there quickly. Jia mentioned that she would end things for the day and was going to give Shin all the compensation. However, Shin told her they couldn't leave yet. Since the goblins were on high alert, they would remain in the area for a while, making it too dangerous for them to leave just yet. He also thought they might have dropped the rescue player they were provided with while running, so they had no choice but to wait until the goblins left. Jia was shocked and asked that when will we be able to leave. Shin replied it could take half a day, but depending on the situation, it might take longer. Jia was already stunned by the thought of waiting half a day. Shin considered it a lie. He thought the goblins would leave in about 30 minutes. They weren't monsters with that much coordination after all. The real issue was something else: the king of the stretch. Jia, in her current state, seemed like she would believe anything he said, but the problem now was getting her to go into the cave with him. He wasn't sure if she would agree to it and wondered if there was any other option. Jia apologized, saying it was all her fault. She regretted not fighting the goblins properly and for insisting on going out alone in the first place. She apologized again, feeling like she would cause trouble once more. She couldn't believe she had ended up in such a situation in a D-rank dungeon, thinking someone like her shouldn't have even entered one. Seeing her worried, Shin snapped in front of her, telling her that if she was so sorry, she should just fulfill one of his requests. Jia wondered what he meant. He suggested they talk inside, since they had plenty of time. Once inside the cave, Jia wondered if Shin really needed her help. While she had been an A-rank hunter, she didn't have much experience in dungeons and couldn't even fully understand what he was trying to say. She realized it was about an elite monster. Shin replied, reminding her that she had mentioned earlier it was her first time in Training Gate, so it made sense she wouldn't know. The formation wasn't widely known. There wasn't just a boss monster in the dungeon, there was also a monster ranked below the boss known as an elite. The cave was the habitat of this elite monster. Up until then, Shin had been refused by others and couldn't even fight it. Jia was the first person to accept him as a supporter into her party. Seeing her reaction, Shin wondered if his request had been too awkward. Jia agreed to help if he was fine with it. She thought it was the right thing to do, especially since he had helped her escape from a dangerous situation. She understood how painful it was to be unable to join a party and wanted to repay him for that. As Joe was thinking about helping Shin, the mana detection machine suddenly beeped. The elite monster had arrived. Jia quickly told Shin to get back. She reasoned that even though it was an elite monster, it was still from a D-ranked dungeon, so if she could just land one hit, they would be able to take it down. Jia fired an arrow at the elite, but the monster blocked it with its weapon. She was shocked how it blocked her shot. She had mistaken the situation and realized she needed to attack with all her power. The monster rushed toward her, but Jia froze. In that moment, Shin pulled her back, causing them both to fall, and the monster's attack missed. Joe was worried about Shin's safety. Her mind flashed to the past, where others had once criticized her. The girl had rudely confronted Jia, saying she couldn't even shoot arrows properly. She blamed Jia for nearly causing her death and demanded compensation. Jia tried to apologize, but the girl didn't want to hear it. The girl interrupted, saying Jia's apologies were pointless and just excuses. She claimed that just because Jia had been appraised as an A rank didn't mean the world owed her anything. Then she told Jia to wait and promised to show her who she was really talking to. Jia, now searching for another party after being expelled, had been rejected by multiple groups even though she was an A-rank hunter. They were gossiping about Jia, calling her a failed A-rank hunter. One person mentioned that she had almost killed her party members in a dungeon. Another said they heard that Jia couldn't even kill a weak monster, which was why she was being rejected from even D-rank parties. They wondered what had happened to her talent, questioning if she was going to be like this forever. Jia stopped listening, feeling the weight of their words. She thought to herself that maybe she should just quit being a hunter. After all, because of her, even Shin was getting caught up in trouble. The elite monster wasn't attacking her directly. Instead, it sent its sword to block her attacks, telling her that fighting wasn't really its thing. Jia was surprised to see Shin stepping in. He calmly told her that he knew it would make sense, but asked her to listen carefully. If she could calm down and follow his instructions, they would win. He thought to himself that he had set the stage, and in such an urgent situation, there was no problem activating it. All he needed to do now was buy some time. He told Jia to look carefully at the monster, and if she did, she would be able to see something. Then she needed to fire at that spot with all her power. Jia stood up, sensing something shift. It felt as though every fiber of her being was bristling. It was uncomfortable, but she pushed through, getting into position to attack. She could now clearly see where to strike. She knew this was her one chance and decided to put everything into a single arrow. With determination, she fired at the elite monster. Shin watched as the arrow hit and the monster was blasted away. He realized it had worked and the conditions had been met. It seemed like it had activated for no reason, but he knew it was all worth it. There was a huge hole in the monster's chest and it finally collapsed. Shin mentioned that it would feel unfamiliar and the sensation she was experiencing seemed to intensify throughout her body. The method he used was a bit extreme, but to awaken her, he had to trigger that feeling. Shiv couldn't help but wonder who he really was and how it felt like he would predicted everything that happened. Shiken started questioning what awakening really meant. He told her not to rush and that they had plenty of time. She insisted he stop changing the subject and just give her a straight answer. Just as she was about to say more, she fainted. Shin carried her on his back, commenting that making allies was tough, but at least he would sort that one thing out. They made their way out of the cave, and when she came to, she told him she didn't know why she would acted that way. It felt like she wasn't even herself, and she couldn't believe she had been so rude to someone who would save her twice. She apologized for doubting him and for fainting. He reassured her that it was fine, no one got hurt, all the monsters were defeated, and she should just pull herself together. With tears in her eyes, she agreed. He then asked if she could hand him the necklace he would give her earlier before they entered the cave. She stood up to give it to him, and when he saw its color had changed, he realized she had used it. He reminded her that it was the meteoric sensation, something they only get in an A-ranked dungeon like Harpy's Refuge. The ability of that item was to enhance the senses. When specific conditions were met, the ability would activate automatically, making the user's senses increase rapidly. During that time, it went beyond the normal human limits, allowing them to tap into transcendental senses. The tricky part, though, was meeting those conditions. The user's emotions had to be pushed to the extreme, and for someone with Jia's personality, the best way to trigger it was by using extreme fear. He explained that he had created a situation where she would feel terrified. It was going to be tough, but as long as he did that, he would be able to awaken her. Even with the cost, there were very few items like that on the market, and he had given up on using them. But to think that Tay could get one in less than 2 days, that was thanks to him making everything fall into place so easily. However, he knew this was just the beginning. Jia had only experienced the awakening through the item. She needed more practice to reach the level she would have been at in her prime. He told her her first task was to create a situation where she could focus solely on the monsters. To do that, she needed to change her arrow first. Since she was pretty strong, it should be fine for her to switch from a short bow to a long bow, allowing her to shoot from farther away. That way, she would naturally interact less with the monsters, and the situations where she would get scared like that day would happen less often. There were a few other things she needed to work on as well. She thanked him for all the advice, and he was a little confused by her words. She explained that she was grateful for everything, even the pendant. She had thought she was going to die without being able to do anything. But when she held that pendant, she felt something shift. It was like everything around her stopped, and she felt this secret connection. She could see clearly where to aim, like the target was engraved onto the monster. To be honest, even though she was a rank in name, she didn't feel like she was any better than a D rank in terms of her personality and skills. No matter how hard she tried to change, she only grew more disappointed in herself. But lately, it felt like she had grown so much in such a short time just by knowing him. She began to realize she was more capable than she thought. For the first time, she felt excited about herself and, in a rare moment, talked a lot. As she was about to say more, he told her that it would be tough to do it alone. He gave her his number, so if she ever needed him, she could reach out. She smiled, happy to accept, and promised to share her number too. Just as she was about to, he got an urgent message from Ta and decided to contact him once they were out. The scene shifted to the Hunter Association headquarters, where Ta was on the phone with Shin. After thanking Shin, Ta said he would contact him after the briefing. Ta agreed to help him if he could, and then mentioned that the item Shin had given him last time had been incredibly useful. Shin was already out of the training area and parting ways with Jia. Ta expressed relief that the item had helped and thanked Shin for agreeing to assist him, then ended the call. While Ta was waiting in her room, Min came in saying that the association president had sent word and they could move out now. They both left the room, and as they walked, Min wondered about the unusual situation. Usually, the president would send an official document, but today he was summoning Ta personally. The commissions sent through official channels were always tough, so if the president was calling him in, it might mean an S-rank gate had appeared again. Tae reassured her that it was fine since Shin had agreed to help as well. He said if Tae just fought like he had before, there wouldn't be any danger. He felt it was the right decision to build a connection with Shin. Min noticed Ta seemed in a much better mood after the Arakshani dungeon raid. She guessed it had something to do with that mysterious maker. He had been acting differently ever since, and she couldn't help but wonder about the unlimited support. She also found it shocking that the guild master would offer such generous conditions. Even though Tae was no longer in the berserker class, which made it hard to control emotions, he was more calculated and cool-headed than anyone. Min couldn't help but wonder if Shin was more capable than she initially thought. But then again, there was no way a D rank would be able to create a weapon that would satisfy someone like Ta. Since Ta didn't bring up Shin often, Min decided she would need to look into it herself. They both arrived in front of a room to meet a man who greeted Ta, asking if he had come alone. Ta wondered if someone else was supposed to be with him. The man replied that from what he had heard, 2 guild masters were supposed to come, but since Ta came alone, he could head inside first. Ta then asked if the man knew who the other guild master was. The man said the other guild master had just arrived. A voice called out to Ta, asking if it was really him and mentioning that Ta had been very active lately. Ta and Min turned around, recognizing the person who clearly pissed him off. The man commented that he hadn't thought it would be enough just to see him there. The other guild master was Kim Mi-hyuk, and he had come to take a jab at Ta, wondering who he was and whether he was the guild master. Ta thought to himself that Kim was incredibly annoying. Kim stepped closer, saying that Tae's guild was capable, but he needed to correct himself. It wasn't the Overkill guild that was the problem, but rather the guild master himself. Ta told Kim he wasn't free enough to entertain his ridiculous provocations. Kim shrugged, saying that Ta must be busy purposely choosing and touring low-ranked dungeons and probably wanted some comfort from rookies in low-ranked gates. Min was seething with anger at Kim's words about Ta. Kim continued, explaining that while there had been some coincidental cases where they entered rank error dungeons, their goal had always been to raid, not rescue. They had gone in on their own terms. Just as Min was about to argue back, Teta stopped her and told the man at the door to open it. He explained that they were there to meet the president. The man agreed, opening the door and mentioning to the president that the 2 guild masters had arrived. The president responded that he could hear them coming and that those 2 were as troublesome as ever. They entered to speak with the president, while Min, who wasn't part of the conversation, stayed outside. She sat down on the floor, and a man handed her a cup of tea. She thanked him for it. Inside, President Han Xiaoman told Ta and Kim that Heaven had urgently requested both of them 3 days ago after a strange head appeared and disappeared in the suburbs. Ta wondered if it was a rank error dungeon. Xiaoman shook his head, denying that there hadn't been enough confirmation and it wasn't even possible to measure the mana of the gate. Kim was shocked to hear that. Ta thought it was strange that a gate had appeared that couldn't even be measured. Normally, the rank of a gate was determined in 2 ways. First, a special measuring instrument was used to assess the mana of the gate itself, because generally the final calculated rank of the gate would match the rank of the monsters inside. The second method was by combining the reports from the scouts sent by the association. Xiaoman continued, explaining that rank error dungeons happen when a gate's mana increases rapidly, but this situation was different since no measurements had even been made yet. Ta then asked if Xiaoman had sent scouts to investigate. Shiolman mentioned that they had sent scouts 5 times, but none of them had returned. Kim pointed out that Shiolman didn't know the rank of the gate and had no information to share. He hadn't informed Kim about it right away either. It seemed like Shiolman wasn't just trying to shift the blame. They didn't know how long the gate with the unknown rank would stay open, and in that situation, if they left it unchecked, it wouldn't be surprising if monsters eventually broke through. There had been cases like that before, and every time it had been hell to deal with. Just as Shiolman was about to continue, he was interrupted by Ta, who pointed out that it was shameless. But as they said, this was an emergency situation. Shiolman insisted that he wouldn't take no for an answer and needed both guilds to work together and raid the unconfirmed gate. He had originally planned to send the Hyunwoo Guild as well, but due to their sudden foreign dispatch, they couldn't join. This was serious enough to involve all 3 of the big guilds, and the deadline was in 2 days. He promised to prepare the support funds and reward money to the best of his ability. If they needed anything else, the association would do its best to provide. Ta thought for a moment and then asked if they had to create a team based only on guild members. Shiolman replied that it didn't matter, but since the gate's existence could cause chaos and panic among the public, they would only allow a small number of people whose identities were verified. Tae agreed with that. The scene shifted to the Shinwa Guild, where Kim rushed in and threw his coat aside. The others welcomed him, and he asked them to create a team using only guild members, with ranks A or higher. He wanted them to choose who could depart in 2 days. Kim couldn't help but think that Ta must have a trick up his sleeve, and he didn't like the smile Ta had been wearing. Kim saw Ta as an annoying person, and he was determined to use this opportunity to put him in his place. He then asked to bring Kang Yurin onto the team, so he told them to call her. One of the women pointed out that Kang wasn't affiliated with their guild, and with her personality, she would probably reject the offer. Kim wondered who didn't already know that and insisted they bring her by any means necessary. He wanted to see her in front of him, and if they didn't, he warned them to be prepared to never work in that field again. The 2 were shocked but agreed to his orders. Kim thought it was actually better that Kang wasn't affiliated with any guild right now. He planned to scout her properly and use the opportunity to show Ta that even among the big guilds, there were different levels of strength. The scene shifted 2 days later in front of the mysterious gate. Tae was there with Shin, a man and a girl. The girl asked what time it was, noticing the others still weren't there. The man replied that there were 5 minutes left and that the Shinwa Guild was always punctual, arriving right on time. The girl muttered that that was why she didn't like them no manners and joked that if they ever did learn some, she might shoot a hole in their heads. Just then, the man, who was the voice guild master, called her by name Sung Jaeger and gave her a light smack on the head. He warned her to watch her words. She remarked that he was really brutishly strong, to which he glared at her. Without warning, he started chasing her and she quickly ran off. Shin told Ta that his guild members really had a great relationship. Ta replied that even though they might look like that, they were incredibly reliable during battle. He then thanked Shin again for coming, admitting that he would thought Shin would turn him down. Shin explained that he would already mentioned using the item Tae gave him, so he felt honored to help. He also pointed out that there was another reason. 5 days ago, a system window had appeared with a hidden quest that only a small number of players received. The selection for the quest hadn't even started yet, but he was already chosen. There was no reason for him to decline. He went on, saying that although the quests had extreme difficulty, clearing them would reward players with incredible rewards and some people even awaken new abilities. To think it would be tied to that dungeon. Tae apologized on behalf of Kim, knowing the man's rudeness was inevitable. Kim and his team arrived, surprised that they were so early. He apologized, saying he had a lot of work, but it seemed like the Overkill Guild had plenty of time. He teased that they must be spending all their time on low-ranking gates. No wonder they had so much free time. The Vice Guild Master of Overkill Guild told Sung to ignore Kim and not give him any ammo. As she was about to respond, he shut her down, repeating to just ignore him. Shin reminded everyone that the rivalry between the guilds was still as bad as ever. It wasn't just an emotional battle anymore, it was all over the mass media, the constant debates about which guild was stronger. Kim looked at Shin and laughed, wondering if Shin was Ta's hidden card. He acted like he had something up his sleeve, but it seemed like it was just him. Kim then made fun of Shin's clothes, asking if he was on a trip. He was going too far. Raiding a dungeon was no joke, and it seemed like Shin just wanted to get carried. A girl stepped in and told Kim to stop getting mad they had a new member. Kang, who had overheard, asked if they hadn't said they had no time to waste. She didn't think they had time to argue, so they should hurry up and go. Sung was shocked to see Kang and wondered about the lineup of their party. She recognized Kang as the strongest element master in Korea, someone who could use all 6 elements and an S-rank sorcerer. Then, of course, there was Kim and Ta, an all-star lineup. She thought the raid would be a piece of cake, and that she would gladly let them carry her. Shin, however, felt it wasn't going to be so easy. The dungeon they were about to raid was the same one from his last life. Of the 8 party members who had gone in that time, Only Ta survived, and barely, using his tree pass skill. Afterward, the gate had suddenly disappeared, and it became an unprecedented case where 7 high-rank awakened were declared missing. The association had worked hard to censor all the information, so there was almost nothing left about the dungeon. Shin couldn't guarantee they would defeat it this time. They entered and Kim attacked a doll, killing it easily. He chuckled, calling it so easy. Shin was left wondering why it seemed so simple. As they were heading back to the gate, Shin mentioned how cool the place was. The Vice Guild leader told him to lower his voice. Suddenly, they noticed the gate was closed. The Vice Guild leader of the Overkill Guild tried to open it, but failed. He suggested they break it open with force. Shin said he wanted to break it too, so a few of them attacked the door, but didn't even budge. Kim told everyone to step aside as he would handle it. Just then, 2 of the Toro maids came in to attack, but Kim struck them back, wondering what those things were and how they managed to get in his way. One of the girls commented on Kim's skill, to which Kim replied it was no big deal, and asked why he would waste his skill on something so trivial. She then noticed that the monsters were resurrecting. Kim explained that they had a resurrection ability, and they would need to be at a certain level to even stand a chance against him. He created 2 giant hands to strike them all at once. The others were fighting the monsters too. Shin and Kang were standing quietly, and Shin asked why she wasn't fighting. She asked the same of him. He explained that he was a support-based production class. She said there wasn't really a reason, she just didn't feel like putting in effort for a party like this. She was a little excited at first, thinking she would be working with the strongest person in Korea, but now it seemed all just show with no substance. They couldn't even kill 1 monster. Had she known it would be like this, she would have declined the invitation. Shin felt something strange about the polluted mana from the monsters. It didn't seem normal. He wondered if it was like they were tied together by threads. All of the mana seemed connected to an object, and he thought maybe they just needed to break it. He also wondered if he had any reason to show off his skills to them, but it should be fine if he could just use his rental powers. Kang used her ability to make something small appear from the ground. Shin asked if she had enough mana to deal with the bugs, and why didn't she send it over there? She replied that she hadn't mentioned it earlier, and that she only kills what she wants to. As she destroyed a bug, Shin thought it might be worth checking, and then teased her, saying she must be afraid of bugs. She snapped at him, telling him to stop talking to her because it was annoying. He apologized, saying he wasn't meddling, but pointed out that there might be a bug monster nearby. Kim was attacking the monsters as well, but they kept getting back up. Kim wondered why his attacks weren't working. Tae was also fighting them, and then suddenly, everything stopped. Kim wondered what happened and realized he would finally warmed up, though it felt like small fires were starting to burn out in the end. The object controlling the monsters was destroyed, and Shin, absorbing its mana, realized it was the source of their resurrection ability. If he hadn't been able to see the polluted mana, he wouldn't have been able to figure it out. Shin wondered if this was the reason they had failed to raid it in his last life. Ta told the Vice Guild Master that the lobby was basically empty and they didn't know for sure what was going on, so they should research the entire first floor. The Vice Guild Master agreed, saying he would take the lead and everyone should follow him. They rushed ahead and ran into a group of the same monsters. Kim shoved the Vice Guild Master aside, saying he would go first. He attacked the monsters, and Sung wondered if the mana they were gathering was coming from the object inside the self. Shin pointed to a spot and told her to shoot there. She got confused, asking if that would break the controller. Shin told the others what was happening, and in a second, the situation was cleared. There wasn't much to it. Shin thought to himself how quickly they had cleared the first floor, moving through the room so fast. Then they reached the stairs, and Ta said that since they had finished the first floor, it was time to head to the second one. Kim called him a bastard and told him not to act like a leader since he already knew what was going on. Ta told his people to follow him, but as they walked, Kim thought Ta was ignoring them. He was determined to crush Ta's pride too. Suddenly, Kim felt pain and realized he had pushed himself too hard just fighting. He then said they should go, and the girls suggested they go together. Shin felt something was bothering him. From Ta's words, nothing seemed wrong, but he needed to check the room himself. So he entered alone and saw some mana ahead of him. On the second floor, they were attacked with a strong power, and Kim said he didn't have time to use his skills. The others were surrounded and were doing their best to protect themselves. Tae asked if everyone was fine, and he thought about the invisible monster, sensing it was of a high rank. The Vice Guild Master said he was fine, and Sung added that she was okay too, but she couldn't see Shin. Tae was shocked to hear this, and as he looked around, he realized he hadn't noticed Shin and wondered what had happened to him. He called out Shin's name loudly. Meanwhile, Shin, still in that strange room alone, thought the battle outside was going badly. He had finished absorbing the mana and knew he needed to rejoin the group quickly. But as he turned, the door was already closed, and he wondered if there were any enemies inside. Then he saw a girl appear from behind the door, holding a small doll in her hand. Shin wondered what a young girl was doing in the dungeon. She called out to him, asking if he was the hunter, and then told him to just follow her. As she turned to leave, he called out, asking her to wait and how she knew he was a hunter. She replied that the lady downstairs had told her that a hunter would come to save her later and that they should leave together when that happened. Since he had made it all the way here, she figured he must be the hunter the lady had talked about. Shin wondered about that lady. They both headed downstairs, and the girl asked him if he didn't know the lady. She thought it was strange, but she was sure that he was the hunter the lady had mentioned. Then the girl called out to the lady, saying it was time to get it together because the person she talked about had arrived. As Shin looked at her, he thought it seemed like she had suffered some mental damage from something. He excused her, saying he had been sent by the Hunter Association. When she heard that, she immediately got up, asking if he was really sent by them. He confirmed and mentioned that it must be a tough situation for her, but he wanted to understand what had happened. She got on her knees, visibly relieved, and thanked him. She then explained that she was the 4th scout sent into the dungeon. Since the first 3 scouts didn't return, she was ordered to investigate and search for them. However, as soon as she entered the dungeon, dolls from all directions started charging at her. She was taken aback and tried to leave through the gate, but for some reason, the door was closed and the wooden top was blocked, which trapped her inside. Shin thought they were in the same situation and asked if she knew what had happened to the other scouts. She nodded and explained that she had called out their names to check from the entrance, but something felt off. They seemed unconscious. Suddenly, the others tried to attack her, so she ran and ended up meeting the girl who had helped her a lot. She said the lady had played with her too much. Shin asked for the girl's name, and she replied that she was Elizabeth but preferred to be called Beth. He suggested they leave together for now, since staying there alone would be dangerous. She replied that the outside was even more dangerous. On the 2nd floor, they kept battling the invisible monsters. Ta felt the enemy's stealth was slowly wearing off and wondered if they were human-type monsters. Just then, a card fell, and Ta noticed the face on the card. It was similar to the one on the missing scout poster he had received from the association president. Sun also mentioned that the faces of the enemies seemed familiar. When Tae saw the card, he told everyone not to attack, as those were the missing scouts. Ta thought that stealth was a skill that couldn't be used again for a few minutes after its duration ended, and it carried the risk of greatly reducing movement speed. Right now, it would be difficult to knock them out easily. Suddenly, he heard Kim shouting, excited and thinking the monsters were finally learning how to use stealth. But then he realized they were just the scouts. As their speed slowed down, Kim said he would kill them with one punch. He attacked with a punch and Sung even shot at him, aiming for his nose. This only made Kim angrier. Kim asked if Ta had gone insane, pointing out that those weren't monsters, but people they needed to save. There might be a way to bring them back to normal. Kim wondered what the way to save them was, but as he felt the killing intent from the others, he realized there were only 2 choices: kill or be killed. No matter who it was, anyone showing hostility toward him would die, and these scouts were no exception. The unconscious scouts got up to attack Kim, and he warned Sung that if she tried to block him again, she would be the first to die. Sung, furious at his words, was about to act when Tae stepped in between them, telling Kim to stop and hoping he would listen. Kim told him that everyone was blind to their own causes, and he would show Ta how blind he truly was. At that moment, a girl stepped forward to protect Ta. Kim coldly said it wasn't a request, but a deal. He would pass over the raid's rewards and funding to the Shinhwa Guild. With those conditions, he thought it was enough to consider it. An attack came at Kim, but he blocked it with his hand armor, saying it was just a warning. He added that if Ta pissed him off even slightly, he would kill him immediately. Ta thanked him for the warning and thought he would gain a bit of time. Sung apologized to Ta for what she had done, and he told her to take responsibility later. For now, they needed to focus on the current situation and figure out how to save the others. Meanwhile, Beth asked Shin if he had seen the dolls outside as well. Some of them were extremely scary, and she didn't know exactly how, but they were all wrapped up in purple threads. The dolls wouldn't die unless those threads were removed. They would just keep attacking endlessly. The threads were so sturdy that it was hard to break them. She asked if he also thought it was scary. Shin then asked if the dolls would return to their normal form once the threads were removed, and if it was possible to turn his colleagues back to normal. Beth replied that she had heard they needed to stop the device attached to the dolls' bodies once the threads were gone. But if they tried to forcefully remove the threads, the body would collapse. She wasn't sure if that would help, though. Shin thought it was a tough question, but she had answered it so friendly and clearly that he was reminded of another question. On the 2nd floor, they realized that 30 seconds after the stealth was released, they would all be dead. Sung seemed worried and asked Kang if she could help by blocking the movements with ice or something. Kang warned her not to cross the line as the situation was already frustrating her. The countdown continued, and then Kim used his power, getting riled up. He jumped to strike, but he was stopped and realized his skill had been nullified. The pain from earlier was starting to return. Someone told Shin that he had stopped his abilities at the perfect time. Shin was with Beth and said they were almost unable to save them, so it was time to leave it to him from now on. Tai asked where Shin had gone so suddenly. Shin replied that he needed to check something, but it wasn't a big deal, so there was no need to worry. Ta said it was a relief that nothing had happened. But since they were in a dungeon, he asked Shin not to do anything unexpected. They looked back and Shin told Ta that the scouts were starting to use stealth again. Ta moved ahead, telling Shin to stay back. The enemies passed by them, and Ta realized they would targeted Shin, so he warned him to be careful. Shin thought that it was thanks to the polluted mana threads that he could see their shapes. Ta blocked an attack to protect Shin. Shin said he could see the weak points on the dolls and would mark them, targeting them precisely to avoid damaging the main body. Tae agreed, wondering if Shin was talking about those blue shards. As Shin pointed out the targets, Tae attacked and successfully took one down. He thought it worked and realized they couldn't really target them like that. Shin mentioned that the circular device in the center was the weak point and told Ta to aim there. As they attacked, the dolls began to break down, and Ta wondered why they were suddenly breaking now when they hadn't earlier. After defeating them, Tae asked Shin if he had found anything on the first floor when checked earlier. Shin explained that there wasn't anything special, but he had been investigating the dungeon on his own when he happened to meet a surviving scout. The scout's condition wasn't great, so she hadn't come up with them, but Shin was able to hear about the situation from her and also discovered the scout's weak point. Ta then asked about the child. Shin mentioned that Beth had helped him find the scout, and it seemed her parents were trapped in the dungeon. When Kim looked at Beth, he said something seemed suspicious. Some asked him what exactly seemed suspicious. Kim wondered if he had said something wrong and logically questioned how there could be a normal girl involved. The gate was a closely guarded secret, and although it might seem like it had been neglected, the association had been monitoring it every second. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Ta mentioned he understood Kim's thoughts, but it wasn't wise to jump to conclusions so quickly. Kim snapped, saying they were just fixated on finding faults in what he said. He added that they would only kept wandering around because he had been taking it easy on them. Kim wondered if he should just kill all the guild members while he had the chance. Ta told Kim he wasn't one for pointless fights, but he felt it was necessary to give Kim a lesson in maintaining harmony during raids. Their eyes all turned a violet hue, and Sung said Kim was acting like he was above them, so it was time to set things straight using this opportunity. The girl on Kim's side wondered why Sung was acting like he was above them. Instead of saying useless things, why didn't she stop Ta? What would she do if Ta ended up getting killed? Some wondered who the girl thought was going to die and if she really believed Ta would lose. The girl agreed, saying it would be Ta, and told Sung to hurry and stop him. Kim was getting angry, wondering if Sung could even carry her guild master out of there once he was unconscious. Ta was also getting furious. Both of them were charged up with their powers, challenging each other. Shin felt something and wondered what was going on with the situation and why their emotions were escalating. Beth had an aura around her and said all she did was push their emotions a little, but they were fighting like crazy, which was pathetic. She thanked Shin for helping her easily use the brainwashing skill on them and mentioned that she needed to get close without raising suspicion. Shin realized he had originally thought of her as a childlike monster. He wondered when he started seeing her as a normal child. Had he been brainwashed since the first time they met? He realized it was too late and that he needed to stop it before everyone got brainwashed. As he tried to move forward, the threads held him back and he became worried. It wasn't just him, everyone else seemed to be affected too. He wondered if this was how everyone was getting brainwashed. To think that she would use the corrupted mana to manipulate not only the physical body but also the mind, and yet he hadn't caught on to her lies. Suddenly, his passive skill, mana absorption, activated, and he realized she had chosen the wrong opponent. As he absorbed their mana, Kim wondered what was happening. Beth realized that Shin knew how to absorb corrupted mana, and she found it amusing. Shin shouted at them, telling them that Beth was from the academy and they needed to attack her. Beth called out to her parents, and they both appeared. She told them that these people were bullying her and asked for punishment. Kim prepared to attack, saying he would kill them all in one blow. Beth told Shin it was time for him to show off. Kim launched an attack, causing damage to the area, and asked him what he was doing. Kim was now under Beth's control, and the thread was working its way inside him. Beth was pleased with the results. Shin wondered if the corrupted mana he had sensed from Kim's hand earlier was because of this. Beth said that Lewis liked to hide behind those who were shy, so no one noticed. She found it fun that in this situation, they had to face their teammates as enemies, with their teammate now turned into a doll. She wondered what would happen next. Ta got ready to attack Kim, saying he would quickly apprehend him, and asked the others to assist him. The others agreed, and just as they were about to move in, Kim created a barrier around himself. Some wondered what it was. A girl explained that it was a skill Kim activated whenever he felt his life was in danger. The barrier was impenetrable and couldn't be interfered with for a set amount of time, and once it was active, it would stay up for several hours. Beth said that with one person already unable to fight, it only needed to deal with the three of them and end it quickly. Shin could tell. just from the energy he felt from them, that these dolls were different from the others he would encountered. Each one felt like a tough dungeon boss, and ignoring the 2 guards to pass through would be way too dangerous. It would be safer to face them head-on even if it didn't feel great. It might just be a gut feeling, but something about them seemed off, like they weren't just typical control-type dolls. Tae asked to take on the female doll, while he would handle the male one. The plan was to focus their firepower on them and end things quickly. Sung was on board with this. As the male doll charged toward Tae, Tae was ready with his flare sword. Shin watched the boy working with an ice piece and some mana threads, wondering if it was a skill that could turn enemies into dolls and control them. Was there a bug in the system interfering with Kim's impenetrable ki? Shin suspected this ability had something to do with turning hunters into dolls, but no matter how much he thought about it, something didn't add up. The transformation Kim had gone through had been instant, even after he absorbed all the polluted mana from everyone. So before he used his mana absorption, when everyone, himself included, was tied up in the polluted mana threads, Beth had the chance to turn them into dolls. But she didn't do it. While the other members were fighting, Shin kept thinking, if Beth was just playing with them, why would she reveal herself? Not only did she lead him to the list scout, but she also taught him the weak points of those who had turned into dolls. After gaining his trust, she quickly showed her true colors, making everything meaningless. No matter how much he thought about it, something felt off. These weren't the actions of someone who enjoyed internal conflict. It was almost as if she was being forced to fight. Kim managed to land a hit on Tai, and Shin noted his incredible durability. But with the weapon Shin had made for Tai, he could channel his power into it and maintain control, making it ready to explode. Shin kept thinking it was unfortunate, but at least they had the weapon for situations like this. Then Sung called out to the Vice Guild Master, saying it was enough and that it should be soft enough now. She fired an enhanced bullet, creating a massive hole in the chest of the doll, but it was still alive. Tae, fighting Kim, realized things were trickier than he expected. What surprised him most was that there were no variables other than simple physical attacks. He found there was only one left to worry about. While he was concerned about metal-type attacks, he knew that as a berserker, he could resist them to some extent. He then told everyone to stay prepared. Unless there were other orders, they needed to watch out for mental attacks and stay in their current positions. Beth called out to her parents, telling them that everyone had been destroyed. As Tae rushed to attack her, she smirked and said it was perfect timing. Tae landed a hit, causing her small doll to fall from her hand. Sung was pleased with Ta's move and asked if everyone had seen it, reassuring them that their worries were for nothing. Kan commented that Beth had acted like something big was going to happen, but in the end, it was all so boring. Shin thought that it would be best if everything ended there, realizing his assumptions had been wrong. Ta, however, looked at Beth's corpse and reflected that even if she was a monster, seeing the body of a young child wasn't a pleasant sight. Just as he was about to order a retreat, the 4 of them froze, not from magic or mental attacks, but because they felt something they would never experience before, an overwhelming presence. Shin immediately recognized it and muttered that, as expected, the hidden boss Beth, the vampire elder, had revealed herself. The system screen displayed the main and additional goals, along with their rewards. Beth appeared in her true form as a vampire, thanking them. She explained that she had been waiting for people who could destroy her parents, and instead of that, they betrayed her, and now they would live eternally with her power. Beth was furious. She called them ungrateful rat bastards for abandoning her in that useless body, and now she finally felt alive. How long had it been? She hated every second of it, spending all that time in such a weak form. Kang snapped at Sung and the Vice Guild Master, telling them not to just stand there like idiots and to prepare for what was coming. Kang realized that while Ted was talented, facing a monster like Beth alone was impossible. Beth smiled and told Ta that he was being cute, but called him a rat bastard. The 3 of them were confused by her words. Beth then said to let's see, shall we, and she will enjoy a meal for the first time in a while before using essence drain. The group began coughing up blood. Kang thought to himself that high-ranked undead were skilled at absorption-type magic, but from that distance, with this many people, she could suppress them without needing to activate any conditions or prepare in advance. He wondered just how much of a monster Beth really was. Tag activated his flares, and Beth commented that he was strong enough that even in their current state, they couldn't have been a problem for her. If they had been able to use all their power, the results might have been different, but that wasn't going to happen. She crushed something in her hand and attacked Ta. Shin couldn't help but wonder what percentage of a threat did he think they were facing. Tae asked Shin what he meant by that. Shin explained that the Berserker's explosions had a limited output. Tae couldn't keep using 100% of his power all the time because his body and rationality wouldn't hold up. He would heard that Tae adjusted the explosion's output based on the situation, but since he was still new to using the explosion skill, he wasn't completely sure how to manage it. When Tae had fought Arachne last time, Shin believed the output he used was no more than half at his maximum, and since then, Tae had probably been using even less than that. Tay admitted that even so, his strongest sword still broke, and in his current state, he wasn't sure if he could reach a level of output he would never attempted before. But he would buy some time. Shin remarked that he wanted to monopolize Ta's abilities, but he knew that was a ridiculous request. Ta suddenly felt a strange energy and wondered if it was mana. Shin continued, saying it felt like he would be tied to Ta from now on, so he thought it would be best if they kept pushing each other to grow and develop. Using his demonic weapon production skill, Shin had saved 100 units of polluted mana and was searching for a suitable weapon from the demonic realm. Finally, the production was complete, and the demonic Leviathan weapon appeared in front of Ta. Shin urged him to take it and show what he was capable of. Ta felt something was different about the sword. If it had been any other sword, he would have grabbed it easily, especially with all the special abilities it probably had. But this one felt strange despite knowing that Shin had made it. Ta gripped the sword tightly, feeling the power around it. He could tell it was infused with polluted mana, and based on the energy, it must have a flame attribute ability. It seemed incredibly powerful. Beth commented on the polluted mana and the flame's energy, noting how strong it was, but unfortunately for them, she used blood magic to activate her bloodbath territory. As the blood began to seep onto Shin's shoes, he quickly realized it was a wide area skill and wondered if the ability had an absorption and shut-out effect. Beth mused that while the strength of the absorption wasn't as strong as it had been earlier, it was still a versatile skill. She told Shin that his mana management and basic metabolism would slowly be paralyzed and everything down to his bones, muscles, nerves, and veins would melt away. Over time, the pain wouldn't be as intense, but it would still take its toll. Ta kept moving toward her, and Beth thought to herself that Ta was still moving perfectly fine, even after activating his kill-off technique. But honestly, he wasn't perfectly fine. The movements of Tae's body weren't controlled by his own will or consciousness, they were driven by the sword's power. Even the strength he was displaying now felt much stronger than before. Beth thought to herself that this would be more fun, especially when she destroyed the dolls on her end. Tae rushed forward, ready to attack, while Beth used blood magic to launch a thirsty hand attack. As the attack was about to land, Tae countered with a flare from his sword, destroying the attack. Beth was confused, wondering what that power was. It was at least double the strength of what she had seen earlier, maybe even more. Shin, equally astonished, watched as Tae slashed at Beth. She spat out blood, realizing he had been holding back his output up until that point. The system screen then notified Shin that the main goal had been completed, and the raid was a success with the defeat of the hidden boss. Shin received a reward box, hoping it would contain an item to help with mana recovery or capacity. Then the Leviathan sword disappeared. Shin read the description and wondered about the search method. Was the weapon search totally random, or was there some standard for it? Ta returned to normal, his body trembling as he wondered what had just happened. Shin told him not to overthink it and just stay put. Even if Tae tried to get up, he wasn't in any condition to walk. Maybe if he were fully fine, but he had already taken a significant amount of damage to output that level of power. Shin was surprised that Tae had been so reckless with his energy and suggested they rest for a while, since it didn't seem like anyone's life was at risk. Tae reached Beth, who was still able to speak, and she congratulated Shin. Shin thought it didn't seem fatal, so why the raid was considered a success when she was still alive. He then asked about her connection to the dungeon and the dolls, pointing out that the polluted mana controlling the dolls clearly came from her. But despite that, she didn't seem to have control over them. They moved to protect her, as if she were their property. Beth agreed, explaining that the dolls had to protect her because she was their precious power source, the one who helped maintain them. She then shared a story from long ago, saying that on a whim, she had indulged the dolls in a way she normally wouldn't have. She had saved the life of a rat that was about to fall into the water, which would have been an odd story if it had ended there. But the dolls, being a bit strange themselves, couldn't just let their savior go. They invited her to stay with them. It was the first time a human had done something like that, and she ended up trapped in that situation. Beth wasn't sure when the turning point had come, but when she regained her senses, she realized she wasn't a guest anymore, she was a family member. For a short time, she had been so happy, but eventually, she realized the truth. They hadn't accepted her as a family member out of kindness. It was her fault for getting trapped like a doll and giving them the chance to betray and control her in the first place. That was evidence that she had become emotionally soft and weak, which was exactly how they had trapped her in that girl's body, sealing most of her abilities so she could only supply the necessary polluted mana to protect them. Shin wondered, protect them from what? Beth replied that she wasn't sure, but she asked if he had looked outside since entering the estate. The view was fascinating, an endlessly stretching vast desert. No matter which direction you went, there wouldn't be an end. It wasn't a natural desert, but a barrier and artificial space created to protect the estate. She believed her mother had used her power to create it to protect them from the monsters across the fissure. Judging from Shin's reaction, she guessed that his world had a fissure as well, and that's how he ended up here. She felt like their worlds had gone through similar things, fissures appearing in the sky, humans awakening to mana, and one by one, the gates opening. And from those gates came monsters much crueler than a vampire like her. Shin approached her and asked how her world had handled the calamity caused by the gates and how many years had passed since the first fissure. She replied that the calamity was inevitable. Unfortunately, she didn't witness it firsthand after being trapped in that body. She spent dark years unable to move. During that time, her world fell and the estate became isolated. She had only recently regained the ability to move, and since that moment, the system window had appeared before her eyes. Shin understood that she was referring to the system window and realized she was a player too. Noticing the confusion on his face, Beth acknowledged that he probably had a lot of questions. She apologized, admitting that she didn't think she would be able to answer them all. Then, as her body started to break down, she mentioned that death wasn't so bad after all. Shin thought her body was collapsing. The system window notified him that the demonic cycles of control could be used. He opened it, gave a small smile, and did something to her neck. She asked what he was doing, and he replied that it wasn't just a coincidence. He could say it wasn't necessary to use it until now, but personally, he was curious. The system then announced that upon successful equipping, the relevant monster would be held from their critical condition and become a subordinate familiar to the player who equipped the item. Shin mentioned that while he would see many players with familiars, this was a first for him having a player as a familiar. Finally, the contract was complete, and the screen showed that she had been registered as his familiar. He mentioned that while he didn't expect her to take on a different form, it was still a surprise that she turned into a cat instead of a bat. Even her necklace had transformed to match the change. She shifted back into her human form, telling him not to make her fall in love with him and how he had used her as a familiar. She said it was more than just humiliating, it was painful. He wondered if she could even maintain her human form for long, but it seemed unlikely. Still, she had no right to refuse this humiliation. The screen flashed a message, explaining that if corrupted mana or any mana was supplied, the lock on the familiar's abilities could be temporarily disabled. He found it strange that a familiar couldn't even do something as simple as transform. He wasn't sure what to make of her or what he could use her for, but now they were stuck together. As she changed back into her cat form, he picked her up. She asked him to let her go, but he teased her, wondering if she could still communicate in this form. The conversation drifted from their earlier topic, but he was curious, had she truly been betrayed by those people? She seemed confused, asking what he meant, but she had already told him everything. He told her not to repeat it again. He understood now. He got up but continued, saying that something still wasn't adding up. She explained that they stole her power for their own survival, but she wondered if living like that even had any meaning. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but her family didn't seem very impressive. He wasn't even sure if they had any real rationality or just egos. Rather than being living creatures, they were more like dolls programmed to move in a set pattern. Beth told him there was nothing they could do about it, and that the mentality of humans was meant to evolve to fit their physical bodies. They had ended up this way because they had forcibly used corrupted mana, causing their egos and rationality to wither away. She then asked if he expected her to feel sympathy for those people. He denied that, adding that if it were him or most humans, they wouldn't choose to continue living like that. Shin then thought about the father doll, wondering if he moved bodies he might have it. Beth asked what he was getting at. If it were him, she said he wouldn't have chosen to continue a life like that. So what was the point of saying something like that? Shin used his power to create a purple orb, calling Beth to him. She flew over, thinking how even a simple command like that had a compulsion behind it. As they got close to the orb, Shin told her that he didn't know if she was aware of it, but the orb was known as an essential crystal. It was usually used for black magic-affiliated spells, and it could save a part of her own mana and soul within it. Those people must have taken her power and stuffed it into the doll, bringing their source into it. They might not have had enough power, but they were clearly quite technically skilled. Beth wondered what he meant, and he asked if there wasn't another way. They then appeared in the house, where the family was talking around the dining table. The lady said she had seen thousands of different visions over the past few days, but the results were always the same. The conclusion was that something was happening between two different worlds in the last few years, and that frequency would continue to increase uncontrollably. Even if they postponed it as long as they could, it would be too late to properly prepare for what was coming. Beth thought that this wasn't the present reality but must have been a vision based on memories. She wondered if those were the father's memories. The father then asked about the method and the different dimension hypothesis she was researching. He said if that was the case, at least their family might survive. The mother mentioned that if they received Beth's help, they could at least separate the land around their estate, but the real problems would come after that. If their world collapsed, the estate would be trapped in the space between two dimensions, floating aimlessly until someone from another world discovered them. It could take hundreds or even thousands of years, and in the meantime, it would just be waiting for a slow death. The father was clearly worried, and the boy was adamantly refusing to use Beth. The mother wondered what he was talking about. He mentioned that, as she had said, they could only survive for a few more years. But Beth was different from them. Couldn't they at least save her? The reason their family was still alive was all thanks to her actions on that day. If it was fate they couldn't escape, he thought at least one member of their family should survive, but there was no way she would cooperate with them. They had all tied her with a thread, and she was wondering why they had done that to her when she had trusted them all. They felt deeply sorry for her and summoned crystals into their hands. The boy spoke up, wondering if, after transferring their consciousness into the doll's body, they would still retain their human minds. The father replied that yes, it would for a while, maybe even a few decades, or 100 years, but eventually their human consciousness would slowly fade away. After about 200 years, they probably wouldn't even remember who they were. They would still be the dolls they had to be. Even though their dimension was isolated, they didn't know what kind of dangerous variables might appear. And when that time came, they would protect Beth from those dangers. The father didn't know how long it would take, but they would do everything they could until someone from another world came to take her and save her. Shin had consumed 50 corrupted mana, and then he saw that Beth was crying. He wondered why they hadn't told her about it earlier. Shin told her that if they had, they all would have met their end together. It was a ruin they couldn't avoid. She would have chosen to face it with them. He told her not to sit around and to get moving, as they didn't have much time. The system window flashed, indicating that the freed abilities for Beth would last only about 2 minutes. Shin told her that this wasn't even a complete recovery. To think that 50 corrupted mana only gave her 3 minutes, he wasn't going to waste that expensive price for her to keep crying like this. He thought it was her role to conclude things at the very least. These were the ones who had stayed as dolls all this time, protecting her. The conclusion was that she should help them find peace. Beth stood up, telling him that she couldn't do something like that. How could she? He told her not to be so pathetic. Even if their destruction and deaths were inevitable, they could have organized everything and chosen to live their final moments in happiness. But those people chose not to do that. They trapped themselves, sealing themselves into a life sentence without an end just for her. It wasn't for her or for him, but she should at least do something for the devotion of her family. It was the least she could do. She didn't understand the meaning behind her family's actions, but then she used her power. The system screen showed that the additional goal was achieved, where Shin had discovered the truth about himself. Finally, the dungeon raid was completed and they were taken out by others, as they were all severely injured. Shin was walking on his own and mentioned that he felt like he had been in there longer than expected. He couldn't say that in front of Beth, who was still in cat form. He then asked her what she thought of it compared to her world. She decided there was no comparison. Even the mana she could feel was so weak, but she knew she didn't have the right to choose, no matter what kind of place it was. She would do her best to live there. It was her obligation. The scene shifts to Kang's house at night. She muttered about why she couldn't give up drinking, finding it so annoying. Then she sensed someone and asked what a rat was doing there. Was he there to ruin things until the end? The boy, turning on the light, replied that she called him a rat, which was rude. He said he was just waiting for his colleague, having a glass of wine, exhausted from longing. He figured she could understand that much. She used her power, telling him it was enough of his nonsense, and asked why he was there. Did he want to pay for the bottle he opened? Even his life wouldn't be enough. He slammed the table, frustrated, and said she was being so mean. He wasn't there for personal reasons. He had heard that she had gone to an unconfirmed dungeon, and as she knew, he was quite interested in those unconfirmed dungeons, so he came to hear about how fun it was. After she told him everything, he understood that she hadn't seen it all. It surprised him that the tall and proud queen would black out so pathetically in the middle of a raid. She told him to shut up. The situation had gotten so weird. Even if she was unconscious, she had confirmed the results with her own eyes. She saw Ta finish the boss with just 2 swings of the sword that Shin had given him. And even considering a berserker's explosion, it was an unprecedented amount of power. The boy agreed, mentioning that Ta's ranks were different, and so far it was definitely worth hunting. But Kang wasn't so sure. While all of it was memorable, she thought they should focus on the supporter. She believed the boy was just a D-rank small fry, and that he could only make weapons. But that weapon had endured the full power of Shin, and if they wielded a sword. The man interrupted her, saying that if she knew how to make a sturdy sword, it would be really useful. In fact, it might even be worth carrying around. But in the end, the tool was just a tool. If there was no one to grab the hilt and use it, it was useless on its own. He was about to leave, commenting that the ability of those at both ends of the sword and the purity of the fight were what truly mattered. Everything else, he said, was simply impure. She replied that if he hunted Ta, that impurity might be the main reason for his failure. He agreed, saying that a D-rank supporter the queen was obsessed with was interesting. While it wasn't to the extent of Ta, he was curious about her. He planned to meet her later, and by then he might have killed both Ta and that impurity. The scene shifted a few days later to Shin's room. He was lying on the bed, thinking that he had slept for a few days in a row, but his condition still wasn't recovering. Rather than the demonic weapon production, he thought it was more likely because of Beth's absorption skill. He asked her if there was a way to get rid of the side effects of her skill. However, when he looked around, he realized she wasn't in the room. He wondered where she had gone. After a moment of thinking, he figured it would be fine. After all, she was his familiar, so he could force her to be summoned. She would know that, and she had to be curious about the new world. As long as she wasn't doing anything weird, he would be fine with it. Then he noticed the mischievous treasure chest and thought to himself that he never expected to see one in real life. He wondered if it was a random reward, something frequently mentioned by players. Everything that came out of the box was randomized, and it wasn't just handed to anyone. The objects the chest bestowed were limited to things the owner of the chest needed. The problem, though, was that the function was a bit off, like a sword that was sharp and firm but missing a screw. It could only be used to attack, not to block, like a shield that could absorb any impact without recoil, but would also randomly reflect that impact onto someone else. And despite its extreme weaknesses, what made it so wicked was that it wasn't an unusual item. There were many cases where people tried to use equipment matching the conditions somehow and still ended up seeing blood. If there was one item he needed right now, it was something with the ability to recover mana or increase the total amount. He wondered what type of item would come out and whether it would have any weaknesses. Finally, he opened the chest and a blue light glowed inside his room. He found a ring called Trader's Gluttony, which allowed the wearer to use the skill Mana Drain. He was confused, and then the system screen popped up, explaining that the function depended on the amount of favorability the target had toward the wearer. Frustrated, he threw the ring aside. At that moment, Beth entered the room. Shin thought that the drain ability itself wasn't bad, it was kind of overpowered, but the condition was favorability. And the name of the item was ominous. Beth mentioned she didn't know why he was angry, but it felt like he had a guest outside, referring to someone as an idiot who had come by. Shin looked out from his apartment and saw Kim getting out of a car. He wondered what was up with the state of this neighborhood. What kind of place was Tai letting his supporter, Shin, live in? Even though Tai acted like he was being so generous, he was really just a terrible person. Shin thought that Kim might be right. Kim looked at the apartment building, thinking that it seemed a bit too much for him to scout a supporter on his own. But Shin was valuable enough to make it worth the effort. Even without Ta's report, Kim could feel the situation unfolding for himself. Back then, Shin had done something for Ta, and the energy that came from him was powerful enough to break through the barrier, reaching Kim for a brief moment. Kim didn't understand why Shin was only at D rank, but he was certain Shin had the potential to be at least a rank. That meant Ta didn't hire Shin for nothing. As Kim thought about it, he figured if Shin wasn't entirely loyal to Ta, he would try to approach him. Shin came down to meet him and ask how Kim had found his apartment. No matter how he thought about it, there was no way Kim could have found his address legally. Kim, not bothered by the question, responded that what really mattered wasn't how he found it, but how he received it. Normally, in situations like this, most people would be impressed, thinking that the best guild wanted them so badly. He waved his hand towards Shin, adding that Shin must have been pretty impressed to come out and meet Kim in person. Shin stepped past him, saying that he didn't come to meet Kim and apologized for it. He explained that it was just the renewal date for his helper job certificate. Kim mentioned the things Tae was giving Shin, promising to give him triple the amount. He knew that, after what happened last time, he probably looked like a fool to Shin. But to those with ability, Kim would treat them well, he would give them the best treatment, something no one else could match. Shin replied that he was surprised Kim was self-aware to that extent, but it wouldn't change his response. He would give the same answer he gave to Ta. There was nothing Kim could offer him. Kim got pissed off as he had received the same kind of reply from Kang. He asked if she thought he and his guild were idiots. Angered, he clenched his fists and said that he would show both Shin and Kang what he could offer. He would make it so they would both end up begging him for the job. Kim left, thinking that he would consider this before. The Hunter Association's accessibility was kind of a mess, and most hunters drove their own cars, which made sense in a way. He bumped into a man and quickly apologized, but the man just walked off without saying anything. Shin felt like his condition still hadn't fully recovered. As he was walking, a person approached him directly. He tried to recognize the face, but couldn't. He wondered if Dojin Hinon was still alive. The scene shifts to a dungeon entrance, where a man with a giant hammer tells his party that if everything's good with their preparations, it's time to head inside. He reminds them that from C-ranked dungeons and above, even high-ranked hunters can get seriously hurt or even die from a mistake, so everyone's probably aware of the risks. But when it comes to safety, they can never be too careful. A girl nervously admits this was her first time doing a C-ranked dungeon or higher. Shin, the helper, wonders if that's true, then reassures her that the tank was a veteran. If they follow his lead, they shouldn't run into too much trouble, though he knows it's not really the helper's job to be giving out assurances like that. They start heading forward, and a man named Yoon Dojin, who's hiding his face and wearing a hood, thinks to himself. He's a D-rank support with a knack for crafting. It's been 2 years since he started hunting, though he's only had about a year of practical experience. He remembers his first year with the Doan Guild, which was led by Hyungmoon Do-yoon. Dojin recalls a conversation he had with Do-yoon during a meal, where Doyoon talked about a D-rank gate. Dojin had asked why Doyoon was interested in a simple D-rank gate when, with his experience and the guild's resources, he should be aiming for something higher, like a C rank. Doyoon had explained that although it was a D-rank gate, its size and the amount of resources it held made it worthwhile. In dungeons like that, the profits were huge compared to the manpower required, which was why large guilds usually took on these kinds of dungeons. Dojin comments that the D-rank dungeons seem so cheap, especially when big guilds were already rolling in riches. To them, a D-rank dungeon was probably just pocket change. But Dojin points out that things were different for newer guilds like theirs. Even if they only get half of what they expected, there's still a lot they can do with it. He could upgrade his hardworking guild members' equipment and train them in exclusive facilities, instead of sharing space with other guilds. There wouldn't be much left after that, but it's enough to build up the guild. Doyoon then tells Dojin to be patient. The whole world will know the name of Doan Guild soon enough. Dojin remembers another day when he received a call with some unbelievable news from the association. He meets a man who tells him that Doyoon was actually a B-rank hunter, and he's even been recognized as a veteran, so it didn't make sense that he would be killed in a dungeon like that. The man goes on to explain that the dungeon Doyoon entered wasn't just any ordinary one. He didn't know what Dojin was aware of, but it was an unconfirmed dungeon. The post-investigation results showed that it was a place with an extremely high level of danger. Dojin was stunned to hear about the unconfirmed dungeon. At that moment, Dojin starts to feel like Doyoon's death wasn't just a simple accident. He mentions that he would look into the gate through an official auction. Dojin didn't know if others knew about this, but he knew Doyoon wasn't the type to lie to him. The man then asks if Doyoon had said anything to Dojin beforehand. Dojin starts to think that maybe someone had manipulated the gate bidding, and he senses that something isn't quite right. But he denies it to the man, telling him that it would be beyond simple common sense. The man informs Dojin that Doyoon's body will be transferred in 2 days once the investigation was complete. He hesitates for a moment before adding that it's fortunate they were able to recover his remains, thanks to one survivor. They were able to collect all the bodies easily because of him. Dojin wonders who this survivor is. The man admits he doesn't know the full story, but it seems like the survivor was just lucky. Dojin pushes these thoughts aside, and just as they arrive at the dungeon, the team leader calls for everyone to get started and enter the gate. He says they will finish the dungeon raid without any serious injuries if possible. As they enter, Dojin can't help but think about how all the guild's veterans, including Doyoon and B-rank hunter, had died. So how did someone like Shin, a rookie D-rank supporter, manage to survive? It didn't make sense no matter how they looked at it. And somehow, it all seemed tied to Doyoon's death. No matter what it took, Dojin was determined to uncover the truth. After a while, a man approaches the gate, but the guards stop him, as hunters who aren't part of the raid aren't allowed in. The man claims he's part of a party and says he must have gotten the wrong time. He shows them his permit and asks them to check it. While the guard checks, the man mutters about how these crazy people would show up at all hours if they weren't connected to the raid. The guard confirms his approval, and the man mentions that it's a relief. The guard asks what that was, and the man responds that it's a relief that he can get in, and he mumbled if he couldn't, they would all be dead. He wonders about Dojin inside the dungeon and thinks to himself that it will be interesting to see what kind of abilities his hero candidate has. Inside the dungeon, the party has just finished off the hated Duke monster. The team leader mentions that they finally defeated it by themselves. But Dojin senses something's off. There's no way this was a C-rank dungeon. In fact, he's sure it's a high-level B rank. If they would kept their abilities hidden until the end, it could have been really dangerous. The team leader thanks the dealer, saying he never thought such a talented person would be with them. Dojin denies it, saying even though the dealer helped, it was only about half of what was needed. He thinks back to the battle with the monster while the team leader was falling back. Dojin had been standing his ground, facing it head-on. Dojin thinks to himself that if he would brought the equipment he usually uses, it would have been much easier. Shin then comments that it looks like Dojin needs new weapons and offers to make him a pair. He asks if Dojin will forget about his abilities once they leave the dungeon. Dojin tries to shake off his thoughts about the strength, cutting power, and weight of the weapons, all of which were a few steps above the gear he usually uses. The fact that someone could materialize such high-level weapons so easily makes him wonder, was Shin really just a D-rank supporter? Dojin calls out to Shin, asking who he really is. Shin replies that he should be the one asking, since they haven't introduced themselves yet. But Dojin already knows his name. Dojin agrees and, removing his face mask, decides to rephrase his question. He asks if Shin knows Doyoon, his older brother and the guild master of Doan Guild, which Shin had been a part of about a year ago. Shin seems confused, and Dojin continues, explaining that he doesn't really care about Shin's identity. What he wants to know was everything that happened to his brother a year ago and whatever Shin's connection to it might be. Before he can say more, an attack was launched at him. Dojin quickly gets ready, drawing his two swords and wondering if there's still a monster left to deal with. But to his surprise, a man steps forward, saying it's an unexpected turn of events. He comments that even though Dojin's best days were ahead of him, he didn't think anyone else could have deflected his attack. To think someone like him was still alive, and that he's already killed the other team members. Dojin thinks to himself that he didn't even notice when the man appeared, but he's clearly incredibly strong. Was he a berserker? Either way, he's definitely talented, a few steps above Dojin. Dojin tells him there's no need to be scared and that he should relax. The man responds, mentioning he had heard there was a D-rank supporter mixed in, but it turns out to be Impurity Boy. Shin wonders what he means by that. The man continues, saying it's a shame because he would hope Shin would put up more of a fight, but that doesn't mean he will let him live. Dojin realizes the man knows Shin too. The man swings his giant sword, saying he's curious to see if they really have something to offer. The hunt will be more fun if that's the case. He then attacks Dojin. Dojin feels the incredible force behind the strike and knows he can't clash head-on with him like he did before, not more than once or twice, at most. If he gets swept up by one of those attacks, it will be over. So he decides he has to avoid and dodge at all costs, looking for an opening. He rushes in to attack, but the man comments that it seems like Shin, the other bastard, was useless. The man doesn't even consider it a 2-1 situation. Shin protests, saying the man was wrong. He's actually tied up with violet threads, courtesy of Beth, and can't move. Shin and Beth both speak up, declaring that it's actually 3-1. The system window shows that since Shin didn't have the saved polluted mana, his stamina and mana would be drastically drained instead. Beth will also be forced out in 10 seconds. Shin, injured and in critical condition, thinks about what he's gained in exchange for the damage just a brief summon. But even so, it's enough time to put an end to this fierce fight. The man attacks them, but Beth uses her fog skill to make it difficult for him to see clearly. The man mutters that it's unfortunate, but pure physical strength-based attacks aren't scary at all. He also notes that while Dojin seems similar to Shin, there's a noticeable difference in their levels. He's sure that Dojin's weapon plays a big part in that. Beth then says, "Looks like it's time to say goodbye." Dojin, seizing the moment, rushes in to attack. The man tries to dodge, but in the end, his arm was cut off. As Beth begins to fade away, she comments that it's not bad at all, though the ending was a bit sloppy. Dojin thinks to himself that while killing the man might be too difficult, he could at least manage to seriously injure him. There's a huge gap in their basic skills, but in this state, Dojin was certain he has a real chance. Dojin tells the man that if he wants to live, he should just drop his weapon and surrender. He adds that considering the sins the man has committed, the outcome will likely be the same either way. The man drops his weapon and gets up, and while Dojin initially thinks it's a clear act of surrender, he instantly senses that the man has something else in mind. As the man prepares to use his power, Shin realizes it's the corrupted mana. Dojin quickly rushes to attack, but the man smirks and says, "Let's see each other later," before disappearing. Dojin sees the magic circle forming and understands it's a teleportation circle. Shin comments that it's a relief, it's just a simple escape item. If it had been an attack or debuff type spell, Dojin wouldn't have made it out in one piece. Looking at Shin, Dojin asks him what happened with Dawn Guild and Duryun. Shin promises to explain everything, saying Dojin has the right to know. Later that evening, Dojin and Shin watch as the association's personnel remove all the bodies of the party members. Dojin mentions that it doesn't sit right with him those people were murdered by that man, yet they both have to lie and claim that the monsters inside the dungeon killed them. Shin replies that they didn't have any other choice. According to the security personnel, they believe the party had 7 members. A few minutes after they entered, someone with an access card showed up late and entered the gate. Dojin couldn't understand how it was possible, so Shin explains that it was possible, even though it seems unbelievable. He mentions that the certificate they used was good enough to fool the security personnel. It might have even been a real access pass. As Shin had said earlier a year ago, an unconfirmed dungeon was openly bid on an auction as a certified one. He didn't know what their goal was, but he was certain that it wasn't something a small group could pull off. If the association caught wind of it, any organization involved would be wiped out in an instant. Shin speculates that the person behind this must be a big player, someone who's important enough that even if they get caught, it won't matter. Dojin probably already understands the basics, but Shin emphasizes that they're not just dealing with ordinary bad guys. This was why they have gone so far as to manipulate the guild members' families, even including Dojin's own. Shin adds that some people might have trouble accepting the reality of it all. Dojin realizes that if they report this officially to the association, those people could end up getting hurt. Shin nods, confirming that's exactly what he meant. Dojin, after processing everything, decides to ask one more thing. Shin's ability. He knows it doesn't make sense for him to be a D-rank maker. So why was Shin hiding his true power? Shin replies that if he goes into too much detail, it will take too long, but up until a year ago, his abilities were pretty much useless. He could only make a sword, and even that was so bad it was embarrassing to be called a D rank. However, during the unconfirmed dungeon incident a year ago, he awakened a new ability while on the brink of death. Thanks to that power, he was the only one to survive. He admits it sounds unrealistic, and even if he were in Dojin's position, he wouldn't believe it either. But when the main culprit and the truth behind it all come to light, Shin plans to reveal everything to the world and their families. He acknowledges that it doesn't justify hiding the truth for so long, and for that, he apologizes to Dojin. He assures him that he will find the people responsible for the deaths as quickly as possible. Dojin, though, wonders what Shin will do when he finds them. He then turns to Shin, telling him not to act like it's only his problem. Excluding the fact that Shin wasn't the culprit, there isn't a single answer that Dojin could accept. Right now, Dojin was no different from Shin. Even though he saw the truth with his own eyes, he still has to keep quiet about it for those who have the right to know. But he will never stop until he makes the people who killed his brother pay. Dojin says he will catch them no matter what, and until then, he's in Shin's hands. From that moment on, they can only count on each other. The scene shifts to an abandoned old factory, where the man arrives after teleporting. He declares that he will surely kill them, though he's not sure who he's even saying it to. A lady standing there responds, saying that the man only realized his defeat after he ran away. She wonders if that's really how pathetic he is. It would have been better if he had returned after being killed, or at least if he were alive in a hopeless state, then she could have used him as a sacrifice. She walks over to him, continuing that there's no need to act like a dog in the rain. That person was still expecting a lot from him. She then makes something appear in front of him, and the man wonders what it is. The object was small with a mouth and eyes. The lady tells him not to refuse and to just eat it. She explains that it will become his new arm. The man, skeptical, asks if she's messing with him. Does she really think he would just eat such a strange, unknown thing? She understands his hesitation, noting that they don't exactly have a trusting relationship. But being picky about this was only possible if he has the circumstances to back it up. Even though it's not his primary weapon, she's unsure if he could overcome this situation with effort alone. The man picks up the thing, muttering that if something happens to him, she calmly states that then he's free to do whatever he wants. As he eats it, he screams loudly in pain. After a while, the lady watches and comments that they actually match better than she expected. She teases him, saying it might take all night to fully take shape, but this was just the first form for now. He gains a new arm, and she tells him that if he uses it after some time, it will naturally transform into a more suitable form. If he doesn't like it, she assures him he can tell her any time. The thing is, it's like her child, so she can do whatever she wants with it. Furious, he seets about Dojin and Shin, vowing to kill them both. He also seets with anger about the person who cut off his hand. The scene shifts to the airport, where a bunch of cameramen and reporters were gathered. A girl sitting with Dojin comments that it looks like a celebrity was arriving, since there were so many photographers and journalists. Dojin responds that it's not a celebrity, but actually a hunter. He then asks if she's heard of the Kinmu Guild, one of the 3 biggest guilds in South Korea. The girl replies that she's heard of it, but wonders why they're coming through the airport, since it's a guild from their own country. Dojin mentions that he's been reading some articles, and apparently there was a special invitation from the United Kingdom, suggesting they must have had to deal with a really tough and dangerous gate. A reporter calls out Woo Hyan's name and asks her how she felt after successfully completing the city at dawn raid. Someone else chimes in, mentioning they heard Hyan received a huge success payment from the British government. Another reporter asks if she thinks the top 3 guilds in South Korea could compete internationally. Hyan's assistant steps in and says they won't be giving any interviews at the moment, but they will respond with an official press release later. As they leave, the lady first expresses her admiration for Hyan, saying she cleared her schedule until the next day. Then she mentions that Hyan has a group interview with the representatives of the Sangha Guild at 11 a.m. The lady also mentioned that 2 days ago, there was a sighting of the executor. When Hyan asked where, the lady explained it happened at an A-rank error dungeon in Baiyang. According to witness statements and the testimony of the barricade member in charge, someone showed up later than the others, and their appearance matched the existing reports of the executor. The association also confirmed that there were 2 survivors. One was a B-rank assassin, and the other was a D-rank supporter. Hyan was surprised that a D-rank supporter had survived and wondered if the B-rank assassin's abilities were especially extraordinary. The lady said she didn't know, but mentioned that both survivors later testified that the deaths of their party members were just accidents that happened during the hunt. Hyan thought there could be several possible explanations. They might be on the same side as the executor, or maybe they were threatened in some way to keep them alive. She knew she needed to meet with both of them because she was curious about what they might reveal. Meanwhile, Shin was in his room, thinking that he didn't expect to find anything, but as expected, there was no record of that man among the great sword users in the Hunter Association's records. First off, Shin knew the man wasn't a well-known hunter, and on top of that, he often changed his appearance. So what Shin could be sure of right now was that the man was connected to the strange incidents happening at the A-Rank-era dungeons. Furthermore, the existence of these era dungeons might even be the work of the organization the man belonged to. Shin also considered the case of the estate where Beth had been and wondered if they could have wiped out all the participating hunters, including Ta. Based on the abilities and potential of the people there, they could have all risen to become heroes in the future. If they had been wiped out, it would have been a huge loss for the future of the world. The fact that they weren't just stopping at forging dungeon ranks and were sending assassins separately suggested that the organization might be planning operations outside of dungeons as well. This meant that the real danger might be lurking outside the dungeons too. Just then, he got a call, and the person on the other end asked if they had contacted Shin. After the call, he went to a restaurant that evening to meet Kang. She commented that she expected a tidier outfit, given the place. She wondered if maybe she had expected too much. Shin replied that he would never been to a place like this before, nor had he ever thought about coming to one. The more time passed, the more distrustful he became of society. Shin didn't think his address or phone number was anywhere in the publicly accessible association database. Kang wondered about his address and asked if Kim had come to visit him. It was obvious what happened. Kim probably came looking for Shin, wearing that greasy smile and with his usual unfounded confidence. But Kang reassured Shin, telling him not to worry. She said she wasn't here to tell him anything hard to hear. She just invited him out because she had a personal interest in him. She even asked if he hadn't come because he was interested or had business with her. Then she invited him to sit, saying she would pay for the drinks. Shin replied that it wasn't the kind of conversation he could enjoy over a drink. If she didn't have anything specific to say, then he would just stick to his business. Kang was curious and admitted she couldn't remember the end of the last dungeon because she had fainted. That's why she asked him how he defeated the monster, because even Tae, given his condition at the time, had no chance. Shin replied that she should be asking Ta, not him. After all, he was a D-rank supporter with no combat ability. In that situation where everyone else was unconscious, there was no way he could have understood what was happening. All he did was use his remaining energy to create a sword, and he didn't know anything else. Kang said that was fine, but Shin was left wondering what she really wanted to say to him. She mentioned that, although it sounded absurd, it was actually quite amusing. A crazy person with a great sword was going around hunting hunters, and the likely next target would be Kang. Shin replied that if his predictions were correct, the fact that she entered in a rank-era dungeon meant she was already a target. Among all of them, she was the only hunter not affiliated with any guild. Kang picked up where he left off, saying they would probably target her first since she didn't have the protection of any organization. It sounded plausible, but she wondered if he was forgetting something important. She pointed out that it wasn't just her, there was a D-rank supporter like her who also wasn't part of any guild and was much weaker in combat ability. If what Shin said was true, then wasn't he the one in a more dangerous situation? She asked him what he thought about that and offered to protect him if he wanted. Shin replied that he had already told her everything he needed to, so he was leaving. He added that she should take what he said seriously because her life was on the line. As he left, Kang called someone, telling them that Shin had left, so she was asking the person to do their best since this was an opportunity they had been given, even if it meant going into debt. She ended the call and wondered what would happen next. As Shin walked alone, his power activated and the same man he would encountered in the dungeon appeared, wondering if he should say they would met after such a long time. The man didn't care about anything else, but he had to acknowledge Shin's guts. Only a few days had passed since their last encounter, yet here Shin was, walking alone at night. Was he really that thoughtless and foolish? The man sneered, thinking that whether Shin ran away or screamed, it would all be pointless. He was sure Shin hadn't noticed him, but Shin was already trapped. The one who set it up was incredibly talented. With the barrier in place, no one would know what was going on inside, and until either Shin or the man died, not even an ant could leave. Shin shrugged, mentioning that it wasn't bad. The barrier only blocked entry, but it was based on a principle that created a virtual space mimicking reality. He briefly forgot about the corrupted mana and felt uneasy, realizing he couldn't sense any presence. He wondered if the man had killed everyone living there. It was a real relief. Though just as capable as the man was, his organization had a level of discernment too. The man was curious about what Shin meant. Shin, however, replied that he had expected something like this to happen and that he thought they would come after him. It might even happen tonight. The man scoffed, calling Shin the perfect target and mocking him for being just a supporter who couldn't do anything on his own. Before Shin could respond, the man interrupted, attacking with his sword and telling him to keep babbling while acting so carefree. The attack landed, creating a cloud of smoke. But when the smoke cleared, the man was shocked to see Shin had created a sword to block the blow. The man thought to himself that this wasn't a half-hearted strike like last time. Any other fighter would have been dead immediately. Shin calmly responded, saying that it was the first time in a year he was able to fight one-on-one without worrying about any witnesses. As for being a supporter who couldn't do anything on his own, well, the man wasn't entirely wrong. Shin then attacked using the grid world and challenged the man to try and keep up. Hyung was in the car when she suddenly stopped, noticing that she couldn't see the sign indicating a gate, but she could feel the corrupted mana. She was a saint, a class considered mid to upper tier among support classes, and she typically used general mana, as well as distinct divine power. Divine power was considered the opposite of corrupted mana, so while some classes might not be able to see corrupted mana, they could still sense it. Her assistant asked if they should report it to the association, since the corrupted mana had appeared right in the middle of the residential area. Hyun suggested they wait for 30 minutes. If she hadn't returned by then, they could contact the association and report as planned. She gathered her power, grabbed her weapon, and headed off. Her assistant thought the area felt like a wall with nothing there, but Hyun seemed to sense something. Then, to his shock, he watched as Hyun passed through the gate. Not only had she crossed, but now he couldn't feel her presence at all. He hoped nothing bad would happen. Inside, Shin released his sword, preparing to attack the man. The man barely dodged, his anger flaring. He yelled at Shin, saying tricks like that wouldn't work on him. Then he saw a grenade fall near him. It was a KM-38 mana grenade, a high-powered weapon used by the army forces for dealing with large monsters. The blast hit the man directly. The lady watched from a distance, wondering how impressive it was that Shin had even made the Empress bow her head. But she thought he was still an opponent who could cause her trouble. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about the weapons he materialized. They were just strong, sharp weapons. However, because they could only demonstrate special abilities when wielded by their creator, it seemed like they had been designed with a focus on physical durability. What was truly incredible was the person using them. She realized Shin wasn't just throwing the weapons he materialized. The speed, angle, power, and pacing were all so precise that even an experienced executor like her was struggling to keep up. Furthermore, Shin was also materializing firearms, using them at the perfect moment and in the right place. He wasn't just exceptional at creating weapons. His application and skill usage were on another level. For someone to use them this effectively, they had to have real combat experience on the level of a seasoned veteran. She wondered if a monster like that had been hiding all this time. After Shin shot toward the man, he thought to himself that while mana bullets weren't very effective against monsters above C rank, they were a different story when it came to humans. The strength and toughness were on a whole other level, and much less so if someone was attacked from behind in a defenseless state. He really didn't want to imagine such a situation, but it wasn't like he was about to experience it himself. He wondered if the man was ready to give up. The man, still furious, called Shin a bastard. Shin replied casually, saying he only asked out of politeness. Then he launched a barrage of swords at the man. After the blast, the fog cleared, revealing that a new arm had grown for the man protecting him. The lady, watching from a distance, sighed and activated her power. She muttered to herself that there was no helping it. She didn't want to get involved if possible, but since her colleague was in danger, it was only right to help. If she had known it would come to this, it would have been better to deal with it from the start. The man mentioned that maybe he was being too greedy. She told him to do his best, and with that, his hand transformed into a weapon. Shin was ready with his sword, thinking that all of this was happening because his right arm, which should have been cut off, was now fine. The corrupted mana at such a level had caused this unexpected change. Shin released his sword to attack the man, but the man easily cut it down with his hand. The attack then came towards Shin, but he quickly created a barrier to protect himself. The lady, watching from the sidelines, commented that it wouldn't be easy. Materializing strong weapons wasn't enough, and it wasn't like Shin had a method to counter this. Shin then remembered the gift man had given him on behalf of Ta as part of his contract with the guild. He grabbed the Bloodstone of Araction, which contained the final cries of the monster Araction. Upon using the stone, he could temporarily take on the same class and abilities as the one who had landed the final blow on it. His skill level and aptitude would match that person's for a minute, but when the time ended, he would lose 99% of his remaining stamina. Shin thought to himself that he never imagined he would use it on his own. He inhaled deeply and used the Bloodstone. As the man rushed toward him to attack, the stone activated, and for a brief moment, Shin had the same team rank and aptitude as Ta. He stopped the man's attack with a giant sword and felt the overwhelming power of being a fighter class. Then the second round of the battle began. Shin attacked using an explosive strike. The lady was shocked when she saw the item and realized it was the one secret she had been able to guess. It was the temporary class change from an item related to the Bloodstone affiliation, and the physical strength and energy he had were only temporary, granted by that item. But that weapon, how was it that she could sense corrupted mana from it? She couldn't believe he had received power from that person, and how could an ordinary hunter use corrupted mana? She thought back to the Beth Estate raid, when Shin had no corrupted mana left. But somehow, even a small amount of corrupted mana in the Bloodstone wasn't missed by Shin's mana absorption. The system window showed that the mana absorption skill had been activated, and he had obtained 100 corrupted mana. Then the demonic weapon creation process kicked in, searching the demonic realm for a suitable weapon. Finally, a sword named Fragerak was forged. Shin quickly attacked with the sword, forcing his opponent back. As the enemy regained his balance and stood up, Shin rushed in again and unleashed a powerful blow. The lady felt something was off. Even though his class had changed, she couldn't ignore his strange skills and movement proficiency. It almost seemed as though he had been wielding a sword for years. Her question made sense. The Arakshans' bloodstone, while it allowed for a class change, didn't provide experience or proficiency. Plus, in his previous life, Shin never had a melee class, so it would make sense that he wouldn't have any fighter experience. That's why the demonic sword Fragerak was able to shine. Compared to the Leviathan that Tao wielded before, Fragerak was a step lower in destructive power. However, unlike the Leviathan, which specialized in firepower, Fragerak had a unique ability as a demonic sword. Shin felt like he was being entranced by something. His senses and consciousness were clear, but it wasn't him controlling his body. Even the thought of wanting to cut felt like the sword was moving him. The demonic sword, which takes over its wielder with its own will. And, ironically, that was exactly what made it so effective. In that moment, the weapon was perfectly in sync with its wielder. As Shin attacked, his opponent was terrified. As he turned to flee, Shin was already moving to strike from behind, slashing him down. As Shin stood there, he felt a sudden strain and wondered if the time limit had run out. The man, trembling, tried to get up, and Shin realized that with his current condition, one more strike would be enough to land a fatal blow. As the man tried to rise, divine lightning struck him. Shin, guessing what was happening, turned to see Hein approaching from behind. She called out to him, saying she had a lot of questions, but it didn't seem like the right moment for small talk. Noting the severity of his injuries, she told Shin not to move and to wait right there. Hein then captured the man, assuring Shin that she would make sure they wouldn't lose him. The man, confused, wondered what was going on with his body, then started bad-mouthing Hein, questioning what kind of situation this was. When Hein didn't respond, he asked if she was even listening, urging her to do something. Hein calmly pointed out that he didn't have any other choice. Then the man was placed into a machine designed to kill by decapitation. Shin and Hein stood there, shocked as the man was killed. The woman appeared, commenting that it wasn't a huge surprise. She hadn't expected it to happen like this, but she didn't think Shin would suffer so much. In the end, the man had been worthless. With that, she removed the useless part. Hein shouted that it was enough, warning the woman that if she made another move, she would attack. The woman wondered what Hein intended to do, and before she could think further, Hein launched an attack using divine power. The woman quickly put up a barrier to protect herself and the man's corpse, remarking that Hein had used divine power, and if she would have been hit, she might have died on the spot. She was lucky that she hadn't been hit by it. Hein was shocked by the divine power and wondered if there was another helper besides the executor and the woman. The lady then said that they would call it a day. She would give in to Shin's demands for now, but she didn't plan on wasting any more energy fighting someone who wasn't under her command. Next time, though, she would come back and make sure to dress him up more gloriously. With that, she used teleportation to escape. Hein then turned her attention to Shin, who had fainted on the ground. Shin woke up on a couch in a strange room, confused about where he was. Had he been moved while unconscious? How long had it been? To his surprise, he felt almost at his peak. He was exhausted. It seemed like he should have been bedridden for a week, unable to move a finger. But instead, he felt completely refreshed. He noticed that his hands were restrained. Just then, Hein entered the room. She told him that she wasn't sure how good his physical condition was, but she had done what she thought was best. She asked him to let her know if he felt any discomfort or if something was wrong. He responded that he thought he was almost fine, all thanks to her. He wanted to thank her for helping and treating him, but then he asked why she had bound him. Hein explained that from now on, she wanted him to answer her questions as truthfully and honestly as possible. She then asked why he had been with those people. She promised to answer any questions he had after that. Shin realized that she already knew his name. He greeted her and then signaled for her to start, asking her to explain what had happened. Hein was an S-class saint widely known among the public, not just the hunters. She was also the guild leader of Hyunmu. Shin thought to himself that in the memories from his past regressions, the Hyunmu Guild wasn't one of the three great guilds. The concept of the three great guilds had been a bit unclear in his past lives. In reality, it had practically been a two-man show between the Overkill and Shinhwa guilds. There was a guild called Soul Link, but rather than being an equal competitor, it was more of a step below Shinhwa and Overkill. However, the current Hyunmu Guild was different. It was now one of the three great guilds, measuring up to Overkill and Shinhwa. The difference between this world and his memories was so vast that he found himself curious about how Hyunmu had managed to rise so far, and Hayam was the key to that success. She explained that, to put it simply, she was just returning home after carrying out her plans. Shin thought to himself that she was the best healing-type supporter, someone who had made a miraculous jump from C rank to S rank. He agreed with her, explaining that he hadn't been with those people and had actually been attacked by them on his way back. He recalled that in his previous life, far from being the guild leader, Hein had been a mere supporter who had plateaued at B rank. He hadn't known her personally, but they had crossed paths a few times when their guilds worked together. As he remembered, she wasn't weak, she had an air of gentleness about her, but it was clear she didn't have the sharp edge she carried now. He couldn't help but wonder why her personality and abilities had changed so drastically. But there was no doubt that these changes had primarily benefited her. In that sense, Shin had every reason to suspect Hein of being in league with the hero hunters, but she had actually rescued him and stood up against those guys. She then said she had one more question. Was he acquainted with the executor? Shin replied that it wasn't a question he could answer, but he would like her to answer his question first. He noted that she seemed to know the executor very well. Given that she hadn't reported him to the association and was personally interrogating him, it seemed like she intended to track him down on her own. So he asked why she was doing that. She responded, asking if he was questioning the person who had saved his life. Shin replied that he wasn't stupid. He couldn't even use magic since he was tied up, and there was no telling when she might decide to kill him, so it made sense for him to question her. She told him that she had already stated that she didn't intend to harm him. Shin responded that he couldn't just take her word for it. It was true that she had spared his life up to that point and fought the executor, but that alone wasn't enough for him to tell her everything he knew. Shin pointed out that Hein had seen it with her own eyes. It could be that, after the merciless killers of his comrades failed and things didn't go well, she fought the executor to rescue him. Or maybe it was all set up from the start to abandon the executor, so she could extract information from him. Somehow, she had managed to get through the barrier the executor had set up, a barrier that supposedly no one could pass. If she really knew about the executor, then Shin's suspicions weren't just paranoia. Basically, she didn't want superficial answers, she just wanted proof that she had no connection to those guys. She laughed when she heard him suggest she had connections with those bad people, saying it was unpleasant. She decided she would tell him about herself first. She started by mentioning that she had a younger sibling named Jian who, unlike Hein, was extremely talented and capable. Shin realized that unless it was someone with the same name, there was no doubt that Jian the Fire Lotus's Jian was one of the players called a hero. And then it hit him Hein was Jian's sister. Hein explained that guilds had recognized her sister's talent and had offered for Jian to join them, but she refused all of their offers. Hein suspected it was because Jian felt like a burden to her and always wanted to be with her. 2 years ago, Jian had come home excited and full of energy. She told Hein that if everything went well, they could start their own guild, and she felt so lucky. As she spoke, Jian pushed a piece of paper toward Hein. It was the winning bid for the gate, the trap that had taken the lives of everyone there. Shin told Hein that the winning bid must have been a forgery and that the gate was likely an unidentified one. Hein asked how he knew, but it was clear he was right. It had been an unidentified gate, and on top of that, it was a high-risk dungeon. Even so, if it had just been a regular dungeon, Jian could have gotten out. Hein continued, saying that when she had been standing on top of a mountain with Jian, that bad boy had shown up. He asked why they had to tire themselves out and said they should at least be loyal to the party members who had left them behind. He acted like they didn't even have a choice in the matter. Jian had gotten angry, creating fireballs in her hands, and challenged him to try it to see if he really thought she would let someone like him do whatever he wanted. He had remarked that she really had guts. Then, he attacked Hein, knocking her down, and said they should get rid of the small fry and get started. Jian had rushed to save her sister, but she failed. That was the last time Hein had seen her sister alive. Even after falling from that great height, Hein was still alive. She got up and left, determined to see her sister again. But when she finally reached her, she found Jian dead, lying there. Hein kept telling Shin that ever since that day, she had done everything she could to get stronger. She desperately honed her abilities as a saint, joined the Hyunmu Guild, and rose through the ranks. Back then, her abilities had been pathetic, but on the brink of death, something had awakened inside her. The only reason she had survived after being pushed off the cliff was because of the skill that had awakened within her. No matter the injury or even the threat of death, as long as it wasn't too late, her healing skill could bring her back to life. That skill had given her status and wealth beyond her wildest dreams, but it hadn't brought her any closer to what she truly wanted to accomplish. That was to find the executor who had killed her sister and uncover the identity of the organization behind him, the one pulling the strings. Shin thought to himself that she was just like him, someone who couldn't do anything and could only watch as their comrades died. He hesitated for a moment after hearing everything she said, not feeling like it was the right time to respond. He then mentioned that it was his turn to speak. He explained what had happened to him and how he knew what he did. Again, he thanked her for sparing his life and apologized for being somewhat ungrateful. As he extended his hand for a handshake, Hein replied that after hearing his story, if she were in his place, she would be on guard as well. It might feel a bit rushed, but she asked him to join their guild. She explained that her guild would soon be on more equal footing with the others, and she thought there could be a day when they became friendly comrades who could easily work together. Just then, Tae rushed in, bursting through the door. He saw them shaking hands and looked confused, unsure of what was going on. Tae was surprised to see him and couldn't help but wonder why he showed up. Hein explained that she wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but she didn't expect Tae to come running like this. He seemed really serious. She went on to say that she and Tae trained at the alumni center together and were assigned to the same group, so she got a lot of help from him. At the start, everyone who awakened had to go through basic mandatory education before becoming a hunter. There was one class each quarter, and in a year, there were 4 classes where the newly awakened entered the city center. That's where they learned the basics of using their abilities, managing mana, and all the laws that every awakened person needed to know. After training, she and Ta didn't really see each other much, but once she joined the Hyunmu Guild, they started running into each other every so often. They had a pretty good working relationship for a while, and then they saw the Executor during the latest incident. Since then, the Executor had been targeting Shin, the only survivor. While investigating the whereabouts of the other survivors, including Dajin Hyein, found out that the Overkill Guild had their eyes on Shin too, which was why she texted Ta asking about him. But Tae denied knowing anything. That response surprised her. It was the first time Ta had lied like that. Hyein figured he must be really interested, which was why she had reached out to him first. She wondered if Ta's side was spying on Shin, following his every move. It seemed like there could have been a serious misunderstanding between them. Ta denied spying on Shin and said it was more important to explain the situation. He also wondered why Shin was there. Hyein asked if he remembered the conspiracy she mentioned before, the one she talked about with him and Kin a while back. Back then, Tai had given them a bunch of information and asked for their cooperation. There was a certain group targeting hunters for various reasons, and they needed to investigate by bringing all 3 guilds into it. But neither Ta nor Kim believed her, even though she understood why Kim acted that way. Ta had said they needed more evidence. Shin thought that Kim and Ta must already know about it. Hein continued, saying it made sense they needed more info, which was why she called him there. That certain group had attacked Shin that night, so she stepped in and stopped them. And Shin was the proof of her words. Tae asked Shin if that was really true. Shin confirmed it, explaining that the people who had attacked him before came looking for him again that night, along with their colleagues. As Tae heard this, he asked why Shin hadn't told him about it earlier. Shin asked if Tae didn't know why. Hein just sat there, familiar with the situation, but still reacting like it was hard to believe. Putting aside the fact that Tom might not believe Shin, it was clear that Shin could have been marked by the association and treated like a lunatic. The risk had to be incredibly high for him, and it wasn't like the two of them had a close relationship. Despite everything, Hyein knew they had kept in contact frequently, but it seemed like Ta had been able to get through to Shin. Still, she wanted to hear Shin's response to her offer about joining her guild. Shin thought the offer was more than just a simple cooperation. Over the last 2 years, Hyein had investigated countless missing persons cases, many of which she believed were linked to the Executor's group. She mentioned that after she started her investigation, she noticed a simple, obvious pattern. In cases involving 2 other guilds, plus a few others that met certain conditions, there were no rank discrepancies or unusual accidents with the gates, let alone missing people. Tae, looking at those conditions, said he didn't think it was simply about the size of the guild. He thought the guilds with influence over the association's system wouldn't care so much about size. It had to be about the destiny of the guild. She explained that in guilds with a lot of members, there were actually more cases of suspicious disappearances compared to guilds with fewer people. When someone went missing in these large guilds, they would often cover it up to protect the guild's reputation, making them an easy target. Shin mentioned that aside from those situations, there weren't any obvious targets. She added that guilds without any missing people usually had solid organization, with a ranked guild master at the core. In these places, even if the guilds were smaller, there was a strong sense of unity, and everyone looked out for each other. They wouldn't just ignore the disappearance of a fellow member. She felt like even though she was openly investigating, and maybe because of her connection to Hyunmu, she sensed that they were trying to avoid her. Even Kim, with his usual personality, definitely took care of his people, which was why he was able to lead the Shinhwa Guild. She suspected they were avoiding unity, but she doubted they could keep it up forever. For now, though, that would be the last thing on their minds. Still, just having that sense of safety was enough to get through for the time being. Tae agreed with what she had said, but there was no need for it to be Hyunmu. When it came to fighting power, the Overkill Guild was one step ahead of the Hyunmu Guild. To ensure Shin's safety, it made much more sense to go with Overkill. Shin was wondering what they were really fighting for. Whatever it was, he seemed unlike himself, and she could see a bit of pride in him. The reason Tae was involved was that Shin hadn't told him about the Executor. Tae was shocked, but Hyein continued to let's assume Shin joins the Overkill Guild. How he was going to explain the fighting power of their members, they have support that he can't compare to. Since she wanted to recruit him, Hyen suggested declaring war on the dangerous secret organization. It's not that they don't have the ability, but it's not something we should decide on impulsively. Shin interrupted, thanking her for the offer to recruit him, but he made it clear that he had no intention of joining any guild. He wondered if Shin thought it would limit his activities, but Shin was just saying that his official affiliation would be with Henmu. He saw it as a way to secure his safety. Shin responded, saying that securing safety wasn't necessary and that he would only be useful as bait. He mentioned that Hyen had said it herself. It wasn't that their turn had been postponed, but rather that even if Himenmu promoted his safety, it wouldn't stop those people. It was just that, for now, they were trying to kill Shin, but someone else would take his place. Rather than focusing on that, Shin wondered what they would think of having him as the main target. At the very least, not only would he become the focus, but others would actually be a bit safer because of it. Tai asked if Shin was suggesting that he would take on the risk instead of others. Shin replied that it wasn't necessarily like that. Even with all the capabilities of the Himmu Guild, they hadn't been able to catch even a glimpse of those bad guys for 2 years. They only had a few clues now, and while they were hoping for cooperation from the Hunters Association, with Shin as bait, they could at least predict the bad guys' next move. If there was another attack like last night's, they could catch them too. Shin took a sip of coffee and continued, saying that at the very least they could gather evidence, which would force the association to act and reveal their existence to the world. Hyen pointed out that Shin was taking this on all by himself. Shin wondered what she meant since he had already told her everything. There was no need to cooperate unless they wanted it, and it seemed like they were just trying to take advantage of him. They didn't know when those people would come, but Shin really believed they would come running as soon as he contacted them. Hyen thought Shin was implying that even if they cooperated, he would take the lead. Eden knew about Ta, but Hyen must have known there was no way she could refuse. Shin said he was in their hands now. The scene shifted to a building at night where a woman with the body of a man entered and told her boss that she had come to report on the executor's work. Her boss asked if the man was done by the Maker. She denied it, saying that although the Maker's abilities were greater than expected, Hyen had trespassed, and after the battle, the executor was no longer usable. She judged that there was a risk of information being leaked, so she took matters into her own hands and disposed of him. But considering how cooperative and impulsive he had been, she thought it might be better to groom him and use him instead. The boss responded, saying that if that was her judgment, she should prove that she was right. He would assign her the permit to use him and fill the empty spot of the executor. She wondered if she had to do it alone. He replied that it wasn't because he didn't trust her abilities, but because hunting was a more important task. He wanted it done properly, without any distractions, and he trusted her to handle it. She thought the boss was asking about her, but then she told him she would do her best. The boss asked, apart from Hyen's trespassing, if the Maker had any special features. From what he knew, the executor only actively approached those he was interested in. She mentioned that the information from the association was off, and that Shin wasn't his average Maker. His weapon materialization quality and proficiency were at least a rank, and using that he was able to hold his ground against the executor in battle quite well. The boss wondered if she was saying that considering the fundamental differences between supporters and fighters, Shin was at least 2 steps ahead of the executor in terms of experience and reading movements. She agreed and added that although it was brief, Shin used corrupted mana, which was quite different from the methods of corrupted mana use she was familiar with. The boss became agitated and told her from start to finish, without leaving anything out, just tell me everything that happened, as detailed as possible. A few days later, Dojin stood in front of the Overkill Guild building on a call with Shin. He mentioned that he had arrived a bit earlier than scheduled just in case, since he had a lunch appointment with Ta. Ta told him he was free at the time, so it would be fine to have the interview at the same time. Shin agreed, jokingly asking for the most expensive meal possible, knowing that Ta wasn't the type to be cheap with food. Dojin wondered how expensive it would be and admitted that he didn't like those kinds of places, but he wasn't sure he would be able to stomach anything because of his nervousness. He knew that by officially joining, he was more or less collaborating with them to resist those guys, but still being one of the 3 major guilds made him nervous just by their name and fame. Shin, however, reassured him, saying that with Dojin's abilities there was no need to be nervous. Dojin appreciated the encouragement. Shin told him to reach out if he ran into any issues. He felt Dojin would be fine, though, because he was talented enough that joining one of the 3 great guilds was nothing surprising. And above all, Dojin still had plenty of room to grow. He was like an unpolished gemstone. Even without Ta's direct guidance, there were plenty of talented people in the Overkill Guild who could mentor him. Compared to when he used to work alone, being with the guild would definitely help increase his abilities. Shin wasn't sure what they wanted, but for now he would serve as bait until they made their move. He remembered his conversation with Hyen, where she asked if he hadn't done anything about it yet. He had replied, as he had said before, and that he hadn't done anything yet and was going to continue acting as a regular supporter, pretending he hadn't revealed his true strength to her. Ta said that since Hyan and Shin had disappeared together, they would probably think he was connected to the guild. Hyan agreed, suggesting they think of another way. Shin wondered what they would do if it turned out they weren't related. Hyan didn't understand, so he explained that since his abilities had been exposed, it was their biggest concern. If a few weeks or even months passed without any contact, those bad guys would likely start surveilling him. Once they confirmed he was on his own, they would reveal themselves. Ta asked if they were supposed to just wait for that time. Shin denied it, saying he would deal with it himself in the meantime. Those bad guys were used to hiding and wouldn't let go of their suspicions, even until the very end. First, they would try to make the bad guys reveal themselves, and if they didn't show up by the end, those bad people would start feeling at ease and come out in full force. That's when both of them would have to make their move. Hyan agreed to follow his plan, then showed him a box, asking him to take it, as they needed to make some preparations as well. The scene shifts back to the present, where Hyan was thinking that Shin was hiding something, but it didn't matter as long as she could get what she wanted for her sister. Shin, on the other hand, thought about how he hadn't told Hyan about his memories from his past life. History hadn't fully organized his memories, and he wasn't even sure how much she trusted him. But the current situation had just coincidentally led him to a quick rise in his career, and now he had become a target after getting on the radar for being involved with Ta. Hyan was a reliable ally, but for now, she only needed to know what was relevant. As Shin sat in a restaurant, Jio walked by and called out to him. He remembered her as someone who wore glasses outside the dungeon, and her vibe had definitely changed a lot since he last saw her. He remembered that she was the future god archer who cleared the dungeon with him last time. After helping her with her ability awakening, they had become close enough to occasionally stay in contact. Jia was usually the one to contact first or ask how the other person was doing. Even if they didn't stay in touch, there would have been no problem finding out how she was. After awakening her ability, she began to distinguish herself, taking on a more serious and determined attitude than before. She had been working tirelessly, to the point where it almost seemed reckless, but despite all her hard work, she kept clearing countless dungeons without showing any signs of exhaustion. In a short amount of time, word of her abilities and growing fame spread, and she quickly became known as a rising rookie.